Gaslighting, the art of warping reality. What if someone could make you doubt your own mind, not by force, not by threats, but by slowly, methodically rewriting your reality until you no longer trust your own memories, your own thoughts, or even your own sanity? This is the dark power of gaslighting. The term comes from the 1944 psychological thriller movie Gaslight, where a man manipulates his wife into believing she's losing her mind. But gaslighting is not fiction. It happens every day. In relationships, in families, in workplaces, even in politics. It is a psychological war where the weapon is deception and the battlefield is your own perception of truth. At first, it's subtle. A misplaced item. A conversation you're sure happened, but the other person swears never did. A small inconsistency that you brush off. You question yourself, but you move on. But then, it escalates. You start hearing things like, "You're imagining things. I never said that. You're overreacting. Why are you always so paranoid?" The gaslighter rewrites past events, denies reality, and isolates you from others who might reaffirm your version of the truth. Slowly, the ground beneath you crumbles. You start doubting yourself. Maybe you really are overreacting. Maybe your memory is faulty. Maybe you are the problem. And once you start questioning your own reality, the gaslighter has complete control. But there's an even more insidious level to this. Gaslighting by proxy. A master manipulator won't just lie to you. They will enlist others to reinforce the illusion. They will convince friends, family, or colleagues that you're unstable, that you're dramatic, that you're the one who always causes problems. Now, when you seek validation, the people around you confirm the gaslighter's version of reality. This is why gaslighting is so effective. It doesn't attack you head-on. It erodes your confidence from within. The longer it continues, the harder it is to escape, because now you don't even trust yourself. But gaslighting is just one of many psychological weapons. Because what if someone didn't just manipulate your perception of reality, but completely rewired your mind? From distorting the truth, we now move to brainwashing, the complete dismantling of identity itself. Brainwashing, the complete dismantling of identity. What if someone could erase who you are? Not just manipulate your thoughts, but completely rewrite them. Strip away your beliefs, your values, your identity, until you become someone else entirely. This is the terrifying reality of brainwashing. Unlike gaslighting, which makes you doubt your own perception, brainwashing goes further. It dismantles your entire sense of self. It doesn't just distort reality, it replaces it. And the most disturbing part? Most victims don't even realize it's happening. Brainwashing doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, a carefully constructed psychological breakdown designed to strip away independent thought and implant new beliefs. The methods vary, but the pattern is always the same. Step 1. Breaking the mind. The first step is destabilization. The victim is subjected to isolation, exhaustion, confusion, and extreme stress. They are cut off from familiar people, places, and sources of information. Their sense of normality is shattered. Cult leaders separate recruits from their friends and family. Prisoners of war are subjected to sleep deprivation and relentless interrogation. Radical ideologies strip people of their former beliefs, making them feel lost, unanchored. Once the mind is weakened, it becomes fertile ground for new programming. Step 2. Installing the new reality. Now, the victim is bombarded with repetition, emotional manipulation, and a strict new set of rules. A new reality is forced upon them. They hear the same phrases over and over again, repeated so often that eventually they stop questioning and start believing. Any doubt is met with punishment, while obedience is rewarded. Slowly, the brain learns a simple rule. Resistance brings pain, compliance brings relief. And then comes the final step, total control. The victim is cut off from outside information. They no longer trust their own thoughts, only what they are told. The manipulator becomes their only source of truth. At this point, they're no longer just following orders. They believe in them. Slowly, the old identity fades away, replaced by a new one. Step 3. The point of no return. Eventually, the victim internalizes their new beliefs. They no longer need external control. They enforce it on themselves. The brainwashing is complete. At this stage, even if they are freed, even if the external pressure is removed, they may still defend their new identity. They may reject those who try to help them. They may believe that their past self was the lie and the new self is the truth. This is why brainwashing is so dangerous. It's not just about control, it's about creating willing obedience. And once a person has been fully reprogrammed, they may defend their captor, their manipulator, their ideology at all costs. But what happens when someone doesn't just accept their new identity, but actively begins to love the very person who trapped them? From mind control, we now step into Stockholm Syndrome, the chilling paradox of loving your captor. Stockholm Syndrome, the chilling paradox of loving your captor. What if the person hurting you was the same person you started to protect? That's the terrifying twist of Stockholm Syndrome, when a victim trapped, manipulated, and isolated begins to form a deep emotional bond with their abuser. And not just a bond, loyalty, dependence, even love. It sounds impossible, but it happens, more often than we'd like to believe. The term comes from a 1973 bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, where hostages defended their captors even after they were freed. They refused to testify against them. One reportedly fell in love with one of the robbers. The public was stunned, but psychologists weren't. Because what looks like irrational behavior on the outside is, in reality, a psychological survival strategy. When someone is trapped with no escape, physically, emotionally, or mentally, the brain goes into self-preservation mode. You start looking for ways to feel safe, and if your only source of safety is the same person who's hurting you, you adapt. Every small act of kindness from your abuser, every time they spare you, praise you, or offer comfort, feels amplified. It becomes meaningful. And slowly your view of them starts to shift. You stop seeing a captor and start seeing someone who cares. Worse still, you may begin to see outsiders, friends, family, people trying to help you as threats. They don't understand. They just want to tear you apart. The result is devastating. The victim not only stays, they defend the very person who broke them. Stockholm Syndrome isn't just about physical captivity. It shows up in toxic relationships, cults, high-control workplaces, even emotionally manipulative families. Anywhere someone uses fear, control, and isolation to break a person down and rebuild their loyalty. And once that loyalty takes root, the chain is complete. You no longer need to be held against your will because your will has been reshaped. But what if the next step isn't loyalty at all? What if the manipulator doesn't want you to love them, just to feel completely powerless without them? From twisted emotional bonds, we now move into learned helplessness, the silent surrender of the human spirit. Learned helplessness, the silent surrender of the human spirit. What if someone could train you to give up? Not by chaining you down, but by showing you over and over again that no matter what you do, nothing will change. That's the quiet horror of learned helplessness. It starts slowly. You try to resist, you speak up, you fight back, but every time you do, you're punished, ignored, or shut down. And eventually, something inside you shifts. You stop trying. You stop hoping. You stop believing there's a way out. This psychological trap was first discovered in the 1960s through a brutal experiment. Dogs were placed in a cage with an electrified floor. Some had a way to escape, others didn't. The ones with no escape learned to endure the shocks. But here's the terrifying part. When they were later given a way out, they didn't even try. They had learned that nothing they did mattered. So they lay down and accepted their fate. Humans do this too. In abusive relationships, oppressive work environments, controlling households, when people are denied agency long enough, they stop seeking it. They begin to think, maybe I deserve this. Maybe there's nothing better. Maybe fighting back is just making it worse. And the manipulator doesn't have to use violence or threats anymore. They've won something far more powerful: your resignation. What makes learned helplessness so cruel is that from the outside, it looks like apathy. People ask, why doesn't she just leave? Or why doesn't he stand up for himself? But inside, the person feels like they already tried. They've already failed. And failing again feels worse than doing nothing at all. It's not weakness, it's conditioning. A learned belief that change is impossible. And once someone reaches this point, they're easy to control. Not because they can't escape, but because they've been taught that escape isn't worth trying. But what if, instead of making someone give up, the goal is to make them cling to you for survival? From helplessness, we now step into cultivating dependence, how manipulators make you feel like they're your only lifeline. Cultivating dependence, the hidden trap of emotional control. What if someone made you believe that without them, you'd have nothing? No support, no security, no identity. What if they became the center of your world, until the thought of losing them felt like losing yourself? This is the insidious power of cultivating dependence. Unlike learned helplessness, where someone is conditioned to believe they have no control, cultivating dependence is about making sure they don't even want control. The manipulator doesn't just take away your power. They convince you that you never had it in the first place. At first, it looks like care. They offer protection, guidance, support. They make you feel safe. They might say things like, "You don't need anyone else. I'll always take care of you. The world is cruel, but I'll protect you. I know what's best for you." And little by little, you stop making decisions for yourself. You start relying on them for approval, for security, for your sense of worth. They become your anchor. Then, the dynamic shifts. Independence is discouraged. Making your own choices, a threat to the relationship. Isolation begins. Friends and family are painted as enemies. They don't really care about you like I do. Doubt is planted. Are you sure you can handle this on your own? At some point, you stop questioning. The idea of leaving feels impossible, not because you can't, but because you don't know who you are without them. And that's the trap. Once dependence is complete, the manipulator no longer needs force. You stay because leaving feels more terrifying than the manipulation itself. In the end, the darkest psychological tricks aren't the loudest, they're the quietest. The ones that whisper, that comfort, that twist love into control. And by the time you realize what's happening, you're already trapped. But it's not the end. Awareness is the first escape. But what if, instead of just making you dependent, they made you addicted? What if they overwhelmed you with love and devotion, only to rip it away at the worst possible moment? From cultivating emotional dependence, we now step into love bombing, the high that keeps victims coming back. Love bombing, the high that keeps victims hooked. What if the sweetest love you've ever felt was a setup? What if the constant affection, attention, and praise wasn't real, but bait in a carefully laid trap? This is the seductive power of love bombing. At first, it feels magical. The intensity is overwhelming in the best way. They flood you with compliments, messages, gifts. They want to see you every moment. They say things like, "I've never felt this way about anyone. You're everything I've ever wanted. We're soulmates." It feels like a dream, but that's the point. It's not love, it's strategy. Love bombing isn't about connection, it's about control. The goal is to build fast emotional dependence before you've had a chance to see clearly. It feels like passion, but it's really a form of emotional flooding. You become hooked on the rush, the dopamine, the validation, the attention. And just when you're fully attached, It changes. Suddenly they pull back. They become cold, distant, confusing. You don't know what happened. You start chasing the version of them you met at the beginning. And that's exactly what they want. Because now you're vulnerable. You start working harder to please them. You tolerate things you wouldn't have before. You blame yourself when they withdraw. You cling to the hope that if you just try a little harder, the real them will come back. But that version was never real. It was a mask designed to pull you in. And the cycle continues. Affection, withdrawal, affection again. Each return feels like relief. Each disappearance feels like punishment. You become addicted to the emotional roller coaster without even realizing you're being manipulated. Love bombing is not love. It's a chemical trap, a hook buried in kindness. And once you're chasing the high, the manipulator knows they can keep you close. But what happens when, just as you try to escape, they suddenly become kind again? Sweet, apologetic, familiar. And just like that, you're back where you started. One kind word, one late-night message, one apology, and all the pain fades. If only for a moment. You want to believe it's real this time. But the pattern repeats and the cycle tightens. Because love bombing doesn't end with affection, it ends with control. From the emotional rush of love bombing, we now descend into hoovering, the final vacuum that pulls you back in. Hoovering, the final vacuum that pulls you back in. What if the moment you finally escaped, they came back? Not angry, not cruel, but loving, apologetic, familiar. That's the sinister beauty of hoovering, named after the vacuum cleaner for a reason. Because once you've pulled away, once you start to rebuild your life, they come back to suck you right back in. And they know exactly what to say. I've changed. I miss you more than you know. I didn't realize how much I hurt you. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. It sounds sincere. It feels real. But it's not about love. It's about reclaiming control. Hoovering doesn't happen when they're strong. It happens when they sense they're losing you. The moment you set boundaries, go no contact, or find clarity, they panic because your independence threatens their dominance. So they use what worked before. Sweetness, promises, nostalgia. They remind you of the good times. They say everything you wanted to hear during the worst ones. And it works. Because your mind is wired for connection. Even after pain, your heart wants to believe that maybe this time will be different. That maybe they really mean it. But here's the truth. If the change only comes when you leave, it's not change. It's bait. And once you're pulled back in, the cycle resumes. Slowly, quietly, the warmth fades. The old patterns return. And now, they know it's even harder for you to walk away because this time, you chose to come back. Hoovering is not a second chance. It's the reset button on manipulation. But not all control is so obvious. Some of the darkest psychological tricks don't look like manipulation at all. They look like guilt, like sacrifice, like you being the one who's always wrong. And that's what makes it so effective. Not every manipulator uses force. Some use your kindness, your conscience, your desire to be good. They twist your empathy into chains, and before you know it, you're apologizing for being hurt. The game changes, but the goal stays the same. To keep you under control without ever appearing like the villain. From emotional bait, we now move into guilt tripping, the silent weapon that turns your conscience against you. Guilt tripping, the silent weapon that turns your conscience against you. What if the more you cared, the easier you were to control? What if your own compassion could be used as a leash, tightening every time you tried to stand up for yourself? That's the quiet devastation of guilt tripping. Unlike shouting or threats, this tactic whispers. It doesn't say, obey me. It says, how could you? And the moment you begin to question your boundaries, the trap starts to close. You express a need, And here, after everything I've done for you, you try to set a boundary and they sigh, I guess I just don't matter to you anymore. You pull away, and they remind you of their sacrifices, their pain, their love. And you feel it, that twinge in your chest, that pressure in your throat, that quiet, twisting feeling that maybe you're being selfish. But you are not. You're being manipulated. Guilt-tripping works because it doesn't attack your logic. It attacks your heart. It uses your sense of fairness, your empathy, your need to be a good person. The manipulator doesn't have to prove you did something wrong. They only have to make you feel like you did. And the moment you start to doubt yourself, you stop resisting. You apologize for things that aren't your fault. You back down to avoid hurting them. You give in not because you agree, but because the guilt is unbearable. And that's the trick. They don't need to take control because you hand it to them. Guilt becomes a collar, soft, invisible, strong, and the more you care, the tighter it pulls. What makes it so destructive is that you don't even realize you're being controlled. You think you're being kind, compassionate, reasonable. But kindness without boundaries isn't love, it's surrender. And guilt-tripping thrives on that surrender, feeding off your hesitation until saying no feels like cruelty, and yes feels like survival. But guilt alone doesn't always work. Sometimes they combine it with something stronger, a fear of losing everything. From the weight of conscience, we move into emotional blackmail, the threat that turns love into leverage. Emotional blackmail, the threat that turns love into leverage. What if love came with conditions? Not promises, not compromises, but threats, subtle, silent, and suffocating. The kind that say, if you don't do this, I'll leave. I'll get hurt. I'll ruin everything. This is emotional blackmail, where love isn't a bond but a bargaining chip. It doesn't always look dramatic. It's not always yelling or ultimatums. Sometimes it sounds calm, almost gentle, but the message is always the same. You are responsible for my happiness, my pain, my reactions. Say no and they threaten to withdraw. Disagree and suddenly they're the victim. Set a boundary and they make you feel like you're destroying them. And it works because it strikes your deepest fear, the fear of abandonment, of being unloved, of being seen as cruel. So you comply. Not because it feels right, but because you're scared of what will happen if you don't. This tactic plays on your sense of duty, your desire to avoid conflict, your longing to protect others. But the truth is, you're not protecting them. You're protecting the version of them they use to control you. And over time, it erodes you. You begin to live for their approval, walking on eggshells, calculating every word, sacrificing your own needs just to keep peace. But peace built on emotional threats isn't peace. It's quiet submission. And like all subtle manipulations, you don't realize the cost until it's too late. Until you look back and see how much of yourself you gave away. Because emotional blackmail doesn't just take your freedom. It convinces you that love demands it. And once you believe that, you start measuring your worth by how much you can endure. You stop asking, is this fair? And start asking, how do I keep them from leaving? But real love doesn't come with threats. It doesn't make you shrink, bend, or disappear. It's not your job to be the emotional life raft for someone who keeps setting fires. Emotional blackmail doesn't build connection. It builds cages. And the longer you stay, the harder it is to see the bars. But what if the manipulation doesn't attack your choices, but your sense of safety? From love twisted into leverage, we now step into fear-mongering, the manipulation of minds through manufactured terror. Fear-mongering, the manipulation of minds through manufactured terror. What if someone made you believe the world was always on the verge of collapse, unless you followed their lead? Fear is one of the most powerful tools of manipulation. And when it's carefully crafted, exaggerated, or weaponized, it becomes something else entirely: fear-mongering. Unlike genuine warnings meant to protect, fear-mongering is designed to control. It floods your mind with worst-case scenarios, overblown threats, and constant reminders of danger, not to keep you safe, but to keep you compliant. You hear, "If you walk away, you'll regret it forever. No one else will ever want you. The world out there is worse than anything I've done to you." It can come from a partner, a parent, a cult leader, or an entire political system. Fear-mongering creates a fortress of terror so overwhelming, so convincing, that the manipulator appears to be the only safe place left. And once fear settles in, it rewires your decision-making. You no longer ask, "Is this right?" You ask, "What if it all goes wrong?" The mind becomes cautious, the heart becomes hesitant, and the manipulator grows stronger. Because fear shrinks your world until only they remain in it. The irony is, the threat isn't usually real. Or if it is, it's magnified to the point of distortion. You're not reacting to reality, you're reacting to a story they've carefully planted in your mind. And over time, it doesn't just affect your choices, it becomes your worldview. You stop trusting your instincts. You second-guess every opportunity, every connection, every escape route. The fear becomes a lens. Everything looks dangerous, risky, hostile. And in that state, the manipulator becomes the only certainty left. You stop moving forward, not because you're trapped, but because you've been taught to fear what's beyond the walls. That's the true power of fear-mongering. It doesn't hold you down with chains. It convinces you the chains are protection. And when fear becomes comfort, you've already surrendered. But sometimes, they don't need to make you feel afraid of the world. Sometimes, they just make you feel like you owe them everything. From fear as a leash, we move into creating a sense of obligation, the debt that's never really paid off. Creating a sense of obligation, the debt that's never really paid off. What if every favor came with invisible strings? Every act of kindness, every gift, every opportunity, secretly tracked, quietly recorded, waiting to be collected later. This is the dark side of creating a sense of obligation. A psychological trick that turns generosity into leverage and gratitude into guilt. It often starts with something helpful. A mentor gives you your first big break. A manager goes out of their way to defend you. A partner supports you through a difficult time, and in those moments, it feels genuine. But then come the reminders. After all I've done for you, you wouldn't be here if it weren't for me. I just thought you were the kind of person who appreciated loyalty. What once felt like generosity now feels like a contract, one you never agreed to, but are expected to honor forever. This tactic is especially common in toxic workplaces, exploitative families, and manipulative friendships. A boss might bend the rules for you, then expect silence when something unethical happens. A friend may offer endless support, then weaponize it when you assert yourself. A parent may remind you again and again how much they sacrificed so you should fall in line. It turns simple gratitude into a moral weight. You feel like saying no is betrayal. Setting a boundary is selfish. You start doing things not because you want to, but because you're afraid of being seen as ungrateful. And the debt? It's never settled. No matter how much you give back, it's not enough. Because the point isn't balance, it's leverage. The goal is not to remind you of the past. It's to control your future. And that's how obligation becomes a trap. It's not about kindness, it's about control disguised as generosity. And once you believe you owe someone something unpayable, you stop asking what's fair and start asking what you can do to stay on their good side. In that state, your choices aren't really yours anymore. You're no longer being guided by values, you're being led by guilt. And guilt, when manipulated, becomes a leash you hold yourself. But manipulation doesn't always come through guilt. Sometimes it begins by eroding your confidence, just enough to make you question whether you even deserve to say no. From emotional debt, we now move to the seeds of self-doubt, the quiet planting of uncertainty that grows into surrender. The seeds of self-doubt, the quiet planting of uncertainty that grows into surrender. What if someone didn't try to control you directly, but simply made you question yourself until you handed over control on your own? That's the subtle and devastating effect of planting self-doubt. It's not one loud accusation, it's a pattern, a soft hum in the background that makes you second-guess your instincts, your skills, even your worth. It might sound like, "Are you sure that's the best decision? I wouldn't expect you to understand the full picture. I'm just trying to help. You tend to overreact." And it happens everywhere. In corporate settings, a manager might dismiss your input repeatedly, only to praise it later when someone else says the same thing. In academia, a student might be told their ideas lack depth, no matter how strong they are, until they stop speaking up entirely. In friendships, someone may casually compare you to others who are doing more with their lives, always leaving you feeling a step behind. It's not outright sabotage, it's erosion, a slow weakening of your confidence until you stop trusting yourself. And once that trust is gone, you become easier to lead, easier to silence, easier to keep in place. Because what's the point of speaking up if you're probably wrong? Why try if you're just going to mess it up? This is how powerful people keep others small, not by force but by suggestion. They don't need to tell you you're incapable. They just need you to start wondering if you are. And that's the tragedy of self-doubt. It doesn't have to be true to feel real. Once the seed is planted, you water it yourself. You start censoring your voice. You look for approval before making decisions. You shrink in rooms where you used to stand tall. It's not just confidence that's lost, it's identity. And when you forget who you are, you'll follow anyone who acts like they know better. But what if that uncertainty didn't just cloud your present, but reached backward into your past? What if someone could rewrite your memories until you didn't know what was real anymore? From doubt in the moment, we now move into memory manipulation, the theft of your own history. Memory manipulation, the theft of your own history. What if someone could change your past, not the events themselves, but how you remember them? This is the quiet crime of memory manipulation, when someone doesn't just gaslight your present, but reaches into your memories and reshapes them, so you question not just what's happening now, but what's ever happened at all. It's more common than we realize. A boss downplays the success of a project you led, saying, "We all know you needed a lot of help on that one." A parent insists you were always a difficult child, even though you remember things very differently. A manipulative partner reminds you of fights and failures you don't seem to recall, conveniently revised to make you the villain. Over time, this doesn't just cause confusion, it fractures reality. You begin to wonder, was it really that bad? Am I exaggerating? Maybe I've just forgotten the details. Because memory isn't a perfect recording. It's fragile, emotional, reconstructed every time we revisit it. And manipulators know this. They don't have to erase the truth, just chip away at it until it's unrecognizable. And once your memories are blurred, so is your sense of self. You can't defend your past. You can't explain your choices. You can't be sure what's real. And when you can't trust your own mind, you'll look to someone else to explain it for you. And that's exactly what they want. This is what makes memory manipulation so dangerous. It turns your own mind into unfamiliar territory. You don't just feel uncertain, you feel lost. And the more you question your past, the easier it becomes for someone else to define your present. Because if they can rewrite your story, they can control where it leads next. But sometimes it doesn't take a rewritten past to break someone. Sometimes all it takes is targeting what's already fragile. From twisting memories, we now move to exploiting insecurities when manipulators weaponize the cracks in your confidence. Exploiting insecurities, turning doubt into control. What if someone didn't have to invent your weaknesses, just notice them and use them? That's the quiet cruelty of exploiting insecurities. The manipulator doesn't need to break you. They only need to find the parts you're already unsure about and press. Insecurities are personal, private, often hidden, but once someone finds them, your fear of not being good enough, smart enough, attractive enough, they become tools, not for support, but for control. It shows up everywhere. A manager highlights your lack of credentials, not to help you improve, but to keep you from asking for a raise. A partner jokes about your appearance, then says, "I'm just being honest, don't be so sensitive." A friend teases your insecurities in front of others, framing it as playful, but always hitting just a little too close to home. These aren't just comments, they're reminders. Reminders that you're flawed, fragile, and lucky to have their approval. And if you start to push back, they'll say, "You're too sensitive. I'm just trying to help. You're overthinking it." And slowly you start to believe them. You stop asking for more. You stop standing up for yourself. You begin to think, maybe they're right. Maybe I am too much or not enough. That's the trap. The more doubt they feed you, the more power they gain. Because insecurity shrinks your voice, your confidence, your expectations. And when you lower your expectations, they never have to rise to meet them. Exploiting insecurities doesn't require force. It just requires attention. Attention to what you already fear, and the willingness to use it against you again and again. And once you start defining yourself by your flaws, you become easier to shape, easier to manage, easier to control. But not all manipulation is about breaking you down. Sometimes it looks like understanding you, mirroring you, becoming everything you want until you trust them without question. From exposed weakness, we now move into exploiting mirror neurons, how manipulators use imitation to gain access to your trust. Exploiting mirror neurons, how imitation breeds trust. What if someone didn't convince you with words, but with reflection? What if, without even realizing it, you started to trust someone simply because they acted like you? That's the hidden influence of exploiting mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are the part of your brain that lights up when you see someone else smile, yawn, cry, or flinch. They're why we wince when someone stubs their toe or feel tense during a movie scene. They're designed for empathy, but they can be used for control. Because when someone subtly mimics your gestures, posture, speech patterns, or expressions, your brain starts to interpret them as familiar, safe, like you. And when something feels like you let your guard down. In a job interview, a skilled manipulator mirrors your tone and body language, making you feel an instant connection. In sales, a rep subtly repeats your phrases and nods as you speak, making you feel understood, even if they aren't listening at all. In dating, someone adopts your interests, habits, even your insecurities, not out of genuine compatibility, but as a tactic to gain your trust. And it works. You start to feel close to them. You open up. You become receptive. But the connection isn't real. It's a reflection. This isn't always malicious. We all mirror people we like, but when done with intention, calculated, rehearsed, it becomes manipulation, not by overpowering your defenses, but by slipping past them in disguise. The trick isn't in what they say, it's how they silently teach your brain, "I'm just like you." And that's the danger. You don't question someone who gets you. You don't protect yourself from someone who feels like a mirror. But trust, built on imitation, isn't trust, it's programming. And by the time you realize they were only reflecting you, they already know exactly how to use what they've learned. Because once they've earned your trust through mimicry, they can reach deeper into your compassion. But what if they didn't just mimic your behavior? What if they used your kindness? What if they reached past your logic, your defenses, and went straight for the part of you that wants to help, to forgive, to understand? From the illusion of sameness, we now move into exploiting empathy, how manipulators turn your compassion into a weapon against you. Exploiting empathy, when compassion becomes a weapon. What if your greatest strength, your ability to care, became the very thing used to control you? That's the devastating tactic behind exploiting empathy. It doesn't involve threats or lies or even persuasion. It works because you're human, because you feel. Empathy is the glue of human connection. It's what allows us to relate to pain, to reach out, to support one another. But when someone recognizes your empathy as a tool, not for healing but for manipulation, they can bend it to their will. They tell you their sad story. They show you their scars. They confess their trauma just as you begin to pull away. And suddenly, you feel responsible. A coworker breaks down emotionally just as you're about to report their misconduct. A manipulative parent reminds you of their sacrifices every time you challenge their behavior. A partner makes you feel like setting a boundary is abandoning someone who's already been through too much. And because you're kind, you stay, you bend, you compromise, you make space, not because it's fair, but because you'd feel guilty not to. But that guilt wasn't born from your actions. It was planted, carefully, intentionally. Empathy is meant to connect us, not chain us. But in the wrong hands, it becomes a trap you lock yourself inside. The most skilled manipulators don't deny their flaws. They present them as reasons why you should forgive more, try harder, give just one more chance. You become the caretaker of their pain, the custodian of their damage, and little by little, you lose the space to tend to your own. That's how empathy turns into captivity. You mistake someone's wounds for their intentions. You confuse suffering with sincerity. But pain doesn't justify manipulation, and compassion doesn't mean compliance. Because if someone uses their brokenness to break you, what they need isn't your help, it's your distance. But not all manipulation makes you feel guilty. Some make you feel free, empowered, like you're in charge when you never really were. From weaponized compassion, we now turn to the illusion of choice, when free will becomes just another performance. The illusion of choice, when free will is just a performance. What if every decision you made was already predicted, nudged, or boxed in without you even realizing it? What if your sense of control was just that, a sense, not a reality? This is the unsettling trick of the illusion of choice. A manipulation so subtle it doesn't remove your options. It simply shapes them. At first glance, you feel empowered. You're told the decision is yours. You're given multiple paths, different flavors, varying strategies. But what you're not told is that every path leads to the same destination, the one they wanted from the start. A company offers 3 pricing tiers, knowing most people will pick the middle one, not because it's best, but because it was designed to look that way. A manipulative leader offers a group the chance to vote on a decision, but only after influencing the context, the language, and the available choices. A toxic partner says, "Do whatever you want," after subtly making you feel like any choice but one will cause pain. You feel like you're choosing, but you're not. You're being directed carefully, invisibly. This trick works because people resist control, but crave autonomy. So instead of pushing you into a decision, manipulators lay out the menu, knowing full well what you'll pick. And the more you feel like it was your idea, the less likely you are to question it. You own the outcome, you take the blame, and they keep the power without ever having to take it. That's why the illusion is so powerful. It protects the manipulator by making you feel like the author of your own story. But choice without truth isn't freedom. It's choreography. And once you realize the path was designed for you, you start to wonder how many of your choices were never really yours at all. But what if you weren't just guided, but used as a pawn in someone else's game? What if someone manipulated not just your choices, but your relationships? From false autonomy, we move into triangulation, when control is gained by turning people against each other. Triangulation, when control comes from chaos. What if someone didn't confront you directly, but instead used other people to control you? What if every conversation, every conflict, every decision passed through a third party, one they controlled or carefully selected. This is the manipulative art of triangulation. A tactic where the manipulator doesn't just influence you, they influence your reality by pulling others into the mix, not to solve problems but to stir them. It often starts small. They casually mention how someone else thinks you're difficult, or how a few people have been concerned about you lately. They tell you what someone said, never directly, never with proof, just enough to plant doubt. And soon, you're second-guessing who to trust, including yourself. Triangulation thrives in offices where leaders pit employees against each other to maintain control. It shows up in friendships where one person subtly plays two others off each other to stay in the center. It's common in family dynamics, when one parent turns siblings into rivals for attention or approval. And in relationships it can be as simple and destructive as invoking an ex to create jealousy, insecurity, or compliance. What makes triangulation so dangerous is that it doesn't just isolate you, it erodes your sense of unity with others. You stop communicating directly. You rely on filtered information. You see people as threats instead of allies. And while everyone else is tangled in confusion, the manipulator sits at the top, controlling the flow, fueling the fire, and watching as trust collapses. That's the power of triangulation. It doesn't just divide people. It ensures no one else is close enough to challenge the one pulling the strings. And when connection breaks down, so does resistance. Because people who don't trust each other won't stand together against the one controlling them all. But triangulation is just the beginning. What if breaking bonds wasn't just a tool, but the entire strategy? Next, we move into divide and conquer tactics, how isolation becomes the foundation for domination. Divide and conquer tactics, how isolation becomes a weapon. What if the easiest way to control people wasn't through fear or force, but by keeping them divided? What if you could hold power simply by making sure the people beneath you never stood together? This is the ruthless logic behind divide and conquer tactics, a method as old as empires and still used today in homes, workplaces, politics, and movements. It's simple. You break bonds so you can tighten your grip. A manipulative boss plays favorites, sparking silent competition instead of collaboration. A cult leader demands loyalty by encouraging followers to report on each other. A partner isolates you from friends and family, not with commands, but with doubt. They don't really care about you like I do. In politics, entire populations are split into hostile camps, too distracted by each other to see who's really pulling the strings. When people are disconnected, they become easier to manage. There's no coordinated resistance. No shared truth, no trust, just silos of suspicion. And the manipulator stays above it all. The only common point of contact, the one voice everyone hears. If you're angry, you talk to them. If you're scared, you go to them. You stop reaching out and start looking up. But what's most dangerous is how natural it can feel. They don't have to say, "Don't trust them." They just plant small, consistent messages. I wouldn't tell them everything. Be careful, some people are jealous of you. I heard they've been saying things about you. And you believe it. You isolate. And in your isolation, their power grows. That's how division becomes control, not by force but by design. Because when you break connection, you break resistance. And when no one stands together, the one who caused the fracture stands tallest. But what happens when that power shift plays out in public, where everyone can see you fall? And that's the whole point. From private isolation, we now step into public shaming, the spectacle that enforces obedience through humiliation. Public shaming, when humiliation becomes a tool of control. What if your silence could be bought not with money or threats, but with humiliation? What if the fear of being shamed in front of others was enough to keep you in line forever? This is the calculated cruelty of public shaming, a manipulation tactic that doesn't just aim to punish, but to perform. It's not about a private correction. It's about making you an example. At its core, Public shaming is designed to send a message. Step out of line, and this could be you. It weaponizes embarrassment. It turns the room against you, and it's incredibly effective, not just because it hurts, but because it lingers. In a toxic workplace, a manager dresses you down in a meeting, not to fix an issue, but to assert dominance. In school, a teacher ridicules a student's mistake in front of peers, not to teach, but to maintain power. On social media, a single error is dragged into the spotlight, not to correct behavior, but to feed outrage and control the narrative. Shame is a psychological burn, and the human brain is wired to avoid it at all costs. That's why this tactic works so well. It doesn't need to be repeated. Once is often enough. And the aftermath is just as damaging. You shrink. You avoid risk. You pull away from others afraid of being noticed. You self-censor. Not because you were wrong, but because you were targeted. And now, everyone else sees what happens to people who speak up. That ripple effect is the real goal. It's not just about controlling you. It's about controlling the people watching. And in communities, organizations, and online spaces, this creates a chilling effect. No one dares to dissent. No one steps out of line, because once shame becomes policy, compliance becomes survival. That's the lasting wound of public shaming. It doesn't end when the room goes quiet. It echoes in how you speak, how you move, how you think. It becomes a ghost that haunts your self-expression. And those who watch, they learn the lesson without ever having to be taught. They silence themselves. But what if shame isn't enough? What if the manipulator needs a scapegoat, a target to blame, to exile, to protect their power at any cost? From the spectacle of humiliation, we now move to scapegoating, the ancient manipulation that survives by sacrificing someone else. Scapegoating, surviving by sacrificing someone else. What if someone could erase their own guilt by handing it to you? What if every failure, every mistake, every uncomfortable truth could be buried by blaming the nearest target? This is the dark ritual of scapegoating. It's not just about assigning blame. It's about preserving the illusion of purity, order, or leadership by choosing someone to carry the weight of everyone's discomfort. And once that person is chosen, truth becomes irrelevant. What matters is that the rest of the group feels clean. The term comes from ancient rituals where a goat, yes, an actual goat, was symbolically burdened with the sins of a community, then driven into the wilderness, one animal exiled to save the tribe. The modern version is no less brutal, just more sophisticated. In families, one child becomes the problem, absorbing the dysfunction of the entire household. In workplaces, one employee is blamed for a project's failure, even if the real issue was poor leadership or planning. In society, entire groups are labeled as threats to distract from deeper systemic flaws. The scapegoat becomes a magnet for resentment, fear, anger, not because they deserve it, but because they're convenient. And because the group wants relief more than justice, no one stops to ask whether the accusations make sense. But here's the cruelest part. Scapegoating isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silence. Exclusion. A slow erosion of reputation, support, and dignity. It doesn't need a courtroom. It just needs whispers, raised eyebrows, a collective decision to look away. And if the scapegoat resists, that's used as more evidence. See how defensive they are? If they break down, see how unstable they are. It's a trap with no exits. Because when you're chosen to carry someone else's sins, everything you do is reinterpreted as proof that you deserve the weight. That's what makes scapegoating so sinister. It protects the guilty by destroying the innocent. It cleanses the group, not by truth, but by sacrifice. And as long as someone else is suffering in your place, you feel safe. But that safety is a lie, because the next time power needs protecting, anyone could be the goat. But what if the manipulator didn't assign blame to just one person? What if they could make everyone believe the safest thing was simply to follow the crowd. From chosen targets to collective pressure, we now move into social proof exploitation, how conformity becomes control. Social proof exploitation. When conformity becomes control. What if the easiest way to control someone wasn't to threaten them, but to show them that everyone else agrees? What if the fear of standing out was stronger than the desire to be right? This is the quiet force behind social proof exploitation, a tactic where manipulators don't push you directly. They just let you see the crowd and let the crowd do the rest. Humans are wired for survival, and for most of history, survival meant belonging to the group. So when we're uncertain, we look to others. We think, if everyone else believes it, it must be true. If no one else is objecting, I probably shouldn't either. If I speak up, I might be the one who looks crazy. And manipulators know this. So they create the illusion of consensus to keep you quiet, compliant, and in line. In organizations, they stack meetings with loyal voices so dissent sounds like chaos. In cults, they surround recruits with enthusiastic members to pressure immediate buy-in. In politics and media, they flood social platforms with repeated slogans and carefully curated popular opinion until you start to wonder if resistance is even possible. This works even when the group isn't real. A few loud voices can sound like many. A handful of planted questions can make everyone else doubt their answers. And a manipulator only needs you to hesitate, to pause long enough to fall in step with the rest. And once you feel like you're the only one who sees the cracks, you begin to doubt your own judgment. Am I overthinking this? Maybe I'm being difficult. They can't all be wrong, can they? That moment of uncertainty is the opening they need. Because social proof doesn't make something right. It just makes it easier to accept. And once you follow the crowd, you become the proof for someone else. That's the danger of social proof. It's self-sustaining. It doesn't require orders, just suggestion. And before long, people enforce the rules not because they believe them, but because they see that everyone else already has. But sometimes, conformity isn't just encouraged, it's demanded. Not through suggestion, but through silence, fear, and forced agreement. From implied consensus, we now enter groupthink induction, how individual minds are erased inside the collective. Groupthink induction. When individual minds are erased by the collective. What if speaking your mind wasn't just discouraged, but quietly punished? What if the price of disagreement was exile, ridicule, or being labeled the problem, until eventually, everyone just stops thinking out loud? This is the chilling result of groupthink induction, a psychological manipulation where conformity isn't just expected, it's enforced. In a group infected by groupthink, harmony matters more than truth. Agreement becomes a survival instinct. It's not about believing, it's about not rocking the boat. In a workplace, no one questions the direction of a failing project because voicing doubt means being seen as negative or disloyal. In government circles, bad policies pass without challenge because no one wants to be the one who doesn't get it. In communities, harmful behaviors are normalized because pointing them out means becoming the outcast. The group doesn't say you must agree. They just reward silence, punish questions, and treat any pushback as betrayal. So people adjust, they shrink, they mirror the dominant tone. They self-censor not because they've changed their minds, but because it's safer to disappear into the crowd. And the more that happens, the more the illusion of unity grows. We all think this. Nobody here disagrees. It's just how we do things. But behind that surface harmony is a group of individuals who stopped speaking, stopped challenging, stopped thinking. What's left isn't agreement, it's quiet compliance. And the worst part? Groupthink doesn't just erase dissent, it makes it unthinkable. You don't just avoid saying the wrong thing, you stop letting yourself believe it. That's the true cost of groupthink. It doesn't just suppress the individual, it reprograms them. And once the group speaks with one voice, there's no room for nuance, no space for change, only obedience dressed as unity. But what if someone didn't just erase your voice, but rewrote your identity altogether? What if they made you believe you were something entirely different, so you'd never question the role they created for you? From collective silence, we now step into cultivating a false identity. How manipulators reshape who you are to keep you where they want you. Cultivating a false identity. When you're trained to become who they need, what if the person you thought you were wasn't really you? What if, little by little, someone else had shaped your self-image until it no longer reflected your truth, but served their control? This is the slow and suffocating manipulation of cultivating a false identity. It doesn't start with force. It starts with feedback. You're always the peacemaker. You're too emotional to lead. You're the responsible one. We count on you to keep it together. You're not the type to question authority. And when repeated over time, these messages become mirrors. You start to see yourself through their eyes. You adjust, conform, accommodate. Not because it's who you are, but because it's who they say you are. This tactic is everywhere. In toxic families, one child becomes the failure, another the golden one, labels that follow them into adulthood, even if they were never true. In controlling relationships, you're told who you are with them and warned that outside the relationship you'd fall apart. In cults, the group strips away individuality and assigns new roles, new names, new values, until your identity belongs to the collective. The danger is that this false identity often feels earned. It's reinforced with praise, attention, belonging. You're rewarded for staying in character. You're punished, subtly or not, every time you step out of it. So you learn to play the role. You internalize it, and eventually you forget it was ever a role at all. You stop asking, what do I want? What do I believe? Who am I really? Because those questions feel uncomfortable, even dangerous, and comfort, even false comfort, is easier to keep than truth. That's what makes this tactic so haunting. You're not forced into a cage. You're handed a costume and applauded for wearing it. And by the time you realize it doesn't fit, you've already built your life around it. But no one should live as someone else's idea of who they should be. And yet, even if you begin to question that false identity, your mind may not let you leave so easily. Because next comes the internal trap, cognitive dissonance, the tension between truth and belief that keeps you bound to the lie. Cognitive dissonance, the mental tug-of-war that keeps you bound. What if the person keeping you trapped was you? Not out of weakness, not out of ignorance, but because your mind was trying to protect you from a truth too painful to accept. This is the quiet torment of cognitive dissonance. A psychological state where two conflicting beliefs exist in your mind at the same time, creating a tension so uncomfortable your brain scrambles to resolve it. Not by confronting the truth, but by twisting it. Let's say you believe you're a good judge of character, but someone you love hurts you over and over again. Now you face a choice. Accept that you were wrong about them, or convince yourself the hurt wasn't that bad. For many, the second option is easier, less painful. Because if you're wrong about them, what else might you be wrong about? What does that say about you? So you justify, you explain away the abuse, the manipulation, the control. You tell yourself, they didn't mean it. It's my fault. I pushed them too far. They're just under a lot of stress. And with every excuse, the tension lessens, but the lie grows. Because now your beliefs are protecting your comfort, not your clarity. You aren't seeing the world as it is. You're seeing it in a way that allows you to survive it. Cognitive dissonance doesn't just keep you stuck in relationships. It shows up in workplace loyalty to toxic bosses, in ideological bubbles, in systems where people support behaviors that contradict their values, because facing the truth would mean questioning their entire identity. And the longer it continues, the harder it is to break. Not because you don't know the truth deep down, but because accepting it would unravel too much. That's the grip of cognitive dissonance. It doesn't imprison you physically, but mentally. It forces you to rewrite your story to protect your belief in yourself and others in the world. And that rewriting becomes the chain. Because as long as your comfort depends on the lie, you'll fight to preserve it, no matter what it costs. But what if your beliefs weren't the only thing being bent? What if emotions themselves, panic, joy, outrage, were being used to infect not just one person, but entire groups at once? From internal conflict, we move into emotional contagion exploitation, how mood becomes manipulation on a mass scale. Emotional contagion exploitation, when manipulators infect the room. What if someone could make you feel what they wanted, not by convincing you, but by making you absorb their emotion? What if fear, anger, excitement, or even guilt could spread like a virus until it wasn't just their feeling, it was yours too? This is the subtle, powerful force behind emotional contagion exploitation. At its core, emotional contagion is a natural, human instinct. We mirror emotions to connect with others. When someone laughs, we smile. When someone cries, we soften. It's empathy in motion. But in the wrong hands, that same instinct becomes a weapon. Manipulators don't need to argue, persuade, or even explain. They just display the emotion they want you to feel loudly, intensely, consistently until you begin to feel it too. A political speaker fuels a crowd with rage and fear, and soon everyone's shouting not because they agree, but because they're swept up in the energy. A toxic coworker storms into a room tense and irritated, and within minutes, everyone feels like they're walking on eggshells. A cult leader weeps in front of followers while delivering a fabricated tale of victimhood, and the group cries with them, not for truth, but for performance. And here's what makes it work. You don't realize it's happening. Because emotions bypass logic, they move through tone, body language, volume, pacing, and they spread faster than facts. Once the room is infected, resistance breaks down. You nod, even if you disagree. You stay silent because it doesn't feel like the right time. You follow the energy because standing still feels unnatural. The manipulator doesn't need your loyalty. They just need your emotional alignment. And once they have that, they have momentum. Crowds become mobs. Support becomes hysteria. A lie becomes a movement, not because it made sense, but because it felt right at the time. That's the true danger of emotional contagion. It makes you believe the feeling is yours, and once that line blurs, the manipulator no longer needs to control your thoughts. Your emotions will do it for them. Because in a room where feelings dominate, the loudest mood becomes the law. But what if they could make that mood feel even more real by making it seem like it's everywhere? Next, we step into the Baader-Meinhof Phenomenon, how repetition makes manipulation feel like reality. The Baader-Meinhof Phenomenon, when repetition feels like truth. What if simply hearing something over and over made you believe it? Not because it was true, but because it suddenly seemed to be everywhere. This is the strange power of the Baader-Meinhof Phenomenon, also known as frequency illusion, a psychological quirk where your brain, once exposed to something, begins to notice it constantly. And once you notice it everywhere, you start to assume it must be important, or common, or real. It begins innocently. You learn a new word. Suddenly, it's in every article, every conversation, every headline. You hear about a car model, and now it's parked on every street. Nothing changed, you just started paying attention. But this harmless brain glitch becomes dangerous when manipulators intentionally trigger it. They don't need to prove anything. They just need to make you notice it. Again and again. A political campaign repeats the same phrases on every channel, every ad, every post, until even skeptics can quote them by heart. A conspiracy theory is echoed through fringe podcasts, YouTube comments, and casual conversations, so often that it starts to feel legitimate. A brand shows up across your social feed, podcasts, and recommended videos until you're convinced it's the most popular choice. And once your brain tags an idea as frequent, it starts treating it as valid. You don't even have to believe it fully, you just stop questioning it. This is how disinformation spreads, how biased ideas get traction. Not because they're persuasive, but because they're persistent. Your brain mistakes frequency for significance, familiarity for truth. And that's all the manipulator needs. Not agreement, just fatigue. Because the more you see it, the less you fight it. And eventually you start to say what everyone else is saying. Not because it's right, but because it's louder than your own thoughts. That's the Baader-Meinhof trap. It hijacks your attention, then tricks you into trusting it. The lie doesn't need to be hidden. It just needs to become normal. Because when something shows up everywhere, it stops feeling suspicious and starts feeling inevitable. But what if they could do more than just repeat an idea? What if they could anchor it deep in your mind so that every choice you made afterward was subtly shaped by it? From repetition to reinforcement, we now step into the anchoring effect, how your very first impression can control every one that follows. The anchoring effect, when first impressions set the trap. What if your very first piece of information wasn't just a starting point, but a trap? What if every decision you made afterward, every judgment, every belief, was quietly shaped by that first anchor? This is the psychological pull of the anchoring effect, a cognitive bias where the first thing we see or hear becomes the reference point for everything that follows. Even if it's arbitrary, even if it's misleading, once the anchor is dropped, your mind adjusts around it. Manipulators know this. They don't try to force your decision. They just control the first number, the first image, the first idea. And from there, you'll do the work of rationalizing everything else. A salesperson starts with an outrageously high price. When they lower it, you feel like you're getting a deal, even if the final price is still inflated. A news outlet leads with a loaded headline. By the time you read the full story, your emotions have already been shaped. A manipulative partner frames a situation with, "You're probably going to overreact." And suddenly, your response feels extreme, no matter how calm it is. Anchors aren't always numbers. They can be ideas, phrases, images, even tones of voice. And once that anchor is in place, your mind starts adjusting everything around it. You don't judge a situation on its own merit. You compare it to the anchor. Well, it's not as bad as what he did last time. At least this isn't as expensive as the first option. Maybe I'm just being too sensitive. And that's the danger. Anchoring doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like reasoning. But your judgment was never free. It was just tethered to a starting point someone else chose. That's the quiet control of anchoring. It doesn't shove you toward a decision. It just gives you a compass that always points the wrong way. And the more confident you feel in your choice, the more effective the manipulation becomes. Because the best way to steer someone's thoughts is to make them think they arrived there on their own. But what if that anchor wasn't just a number or phrase? What if it was an entire frame? Not what's said, but how it's said. Next, we explore framing effect manipulation. How the shape of the message becomes more powerful than its meaning. Framing effect manipulation. When the way it's said becomes what you believe. What if the truth could be reshaped, not by changing the facts, but by changing the frame around them? What if the same idea could feel safe or dangerous, fair or cruel, depending entirely on how it was presented? This is the subtle influence of framing effect manipulation, a psychological trick where the meaning of a message is shaped not by its content, but by its context. Change the wording, change the outcome. This isn't about lying. It's about repackaging. And once you understand how easily perception shifts, you realize how fragile truth can be. A company says their food is 90% fat-free instead of 10% fat. A political figure presents a policy as protecting families, not increasing surveillance. A manipulator tells you, I'm just being honest, instead of acknowledging they're being cruel. Each version contains the same information, but the framing creates an emotional tone that guides your response, and that emotional tone matters because we make decisions not just with our minds, but with our instincts. If something feels right, we trust it, even if the words were designed to create that feeling. Manipulators use this constantly. They frame abandonment as giving you space. They rebrand control as looking out for you. They call pressure motivation. They reframe failure as a learning opportunity while hiding how they set you up to fall. And over time, you stop questioning what's inside the message because the packaging feels so familiar, so comforting, so persuasive. That's the trick. The truth isn't hidden. It's dressed up, polished, and presented in a way that makes the lie easier to swallow. Not because it sounds better, but because it feels better. That's why framing is so powerful. It bypasses facts by reshaping emotions. And when emotions become the foundation of your decisions, you're no longer thinking critically, you're responding predictably. The manipulator doesn't need to argue with you, they just need to choose the frame that makes resistance feel unreasonable. But what if they took it a step further? What if they didn't just shape what you saw, but filtered what you believed? Next, we step into confirmation bias reinforcement, how manipulators feed your beliefs to keep you blind to everything else. Confirmation bias reinforcement, when your beliefs become your cage. What if someone didn't need to lie to you? They just needed to keep showing you what you already believed. What if the trap wasn't in deception, but in comfort, in being fed the same thoughts, the same opinions, the same truths, until you stopped looking for anything else? This is the slow suffocation of confirmation bias reinforcement. At its core, confirmation bias is a natural mental shortcut. Our brains seek out information that confirms what we already believe and filter out anything that challenges it. It makes us feel stable, consistent, right. But manipulators know how to weaponize that instinct. They don't need to convince you of something new. They just flood you with what you already accept until it becomes your entire reality. A political influencer only shares news stories that support their side, while quietly deleting or ignoring any that raise doubt. An algorithm feeds you content that aligns with your preferences, slowly narrowing your worldview into a curated echo chamber. A manipulative leader surrounds you with like-minded followers, reinforcing the idea that dissent equals betrayal. Over time, you stop recognizing the difference between what I believe and what is. You're not being lied to. You're just never shown anything else. And here's what makes it so dangerous. It feels good. It feels reassuring. There's no friction, no discomfort. You're validated, accepted, supported. But your vision is shrinking. You start dismissing opposing facts without reading them. You mock different views without understanding them. You treat discomfort as proof that someone else is wrong when it might be a signal that you're missing something important. And all the while, the manipulator tightens the loop. They give you more of what you crave, more validation, more echo, until the only voice left in your head is theirs. That's the trap of reinforced bias. It doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like truth. But a truth that's never challenged isn't truth. It's a comfort blanket, and the longer you stay wrapped in it, the harder it becomes to see the world as it really is. But what if they didn't just shape what you believed? What if they influenced you beneath the surface, without you ever knowing it happened? From conscious beliefs to subconscious nudges, we now step into subliminal messaging, how manipulation hides below the threshold of awareness. Subliminal messaging, when influence hides below awareness. What if someone could shape your thoughts without ever speaking to your conscious mind? What if the real message wasn't what you heard or saw, but what slipped past your awareness, planted just beneath the surface? This is the eerie power of subliminal messaging, a psychological technique where suggestions are delivered so subtly, so quickly, or so quietly that you don't even realize they're there, but your brain still absorbs them, and more importantly, they still affect you. Subliminal messages don't shout. They whisper, they flash, for milliseconds in a film frame. They're embedded in background music, nestled in symbols, woven into language, and they're designed to bypass your logic completely, because logic can't argue with what it doesn't notice. In advertising, a single image, barely perceptible, can increase your craving for a product. In politics, emotionally charged words are repeated beneath a candidate's voice, priming your brain to associate them with fear or safety. In entertainment, suggestive content is layered under humor or rhythm, making it memorable without ever feeling confrontational. And while many of these techniques are subtle and debated, the effect is undeniable. What enters through the side door of your mind doesn't need your permission. It just needs repetition. Because even when you don't notice something, your subconscious does. It reacts, it stores, it primes your next mood, decision, or opinion. And that's the danger. Subliminal messaging doesn't try to convince you, it simply positions you. It nudges you closer to the desired outcome, thought by thought, without a single conscious objection. So when you suddenly feel compelled, drawn, moved, you won't know why. You'll just feel it. That's what makes subliminal influence so powerful. It doesn't argue, it doesn't explain, it doesn't wait. It slips under the radar and takes root in silence. And by the time it surfaces, you'll think the thought was your own. But what if they could go even further? What if, before you even made a decision, they planted the seed that would grow into your choice? Next, we explore the priming effect, how small cues can shape your actions without you ever noticing. The priming effect, when subtle cues shape big decisions. What if someone could guide your behavior, not by telling you what to do, but by carefully choosing what you see, hear, or feel before you choose? What if your next decision wasn't random or rational, but the result of a quiet suggestion planted moments earlier? This is the psychological power of the priming effect, where exposure to one stimulus subtly influences how you respond to the next one. And the most unsettling part, you'll have no idea it happened. It doesn't take much. Show someone words related to age, retired, gray, wrinkle, and they walk more slowly afterward. Flash an image of money before a task, and people become more competitive and less generous. Place someone in a room that smells faintly of antiseptic, and they become more likely to clean up after themselves. These aren't coincidences, they're mental nudges, carefully calibrated to steer your mood, your tone, your decisions without you ever stopping to ask why. Manipulators use this constantly. A boss primes a conversation with words like team, loyalty, and sacrifice before asking you to work overtime without pay. A marketer fills the room with luxury cues, polished metal, soft lighting, elegant music, before offering you something overpriced. A cult leader primes followers with emotional stories of betrayal before identifying an enemy within the group. You think you're acting freely, but really you're reacting to something that already tilted the scale. And what's so disturbing is that priming doesn't change your thoughts, it changes the conditions under which your thoughts arise. So you still feel like you're choosing, you just never noticed the strings. That's the hidden force of priming. It shapes your mind's starting point. And when your starting point is chosen for you, it doesn't matter how carefully you walk, the destination was set before you even moved. But what if they didn't just guide your thoughts? What if they used words themselves to pull you deeper into compliance, confusion, or surrender, while making you believe you were just having a conversation? Next, we enter suggestive language and hypnosis, how words alone can bend perception and bypass resistance. Suggestive language and hypnosis, when words become invisible commands. What if someone could guide your thoughts, shift your emotions, and steer your actions without ever telling you what to do? What if all it took was carefully chosen words, delivered in just the right way to slip past your defenses and settle directly into your mind? This is the quiet power of suggestive language and hypnosis. Not the theatrical kind where someone snaps their fingers and you cluck like a chicken. This is something far more subtle and far more real. It's about using language to lower resistance, bypass critical thinking, and plant suggestions that feel like your own ideas. Manipulators who use this technique speak in a rhythm that feels soothing. They embed commands inside soft sentences. They imply instead of demand. And without realizing it, you follow. A manipulative leader says, you might begin to notice how much more confident you feel when you agree with the group. A salesperson suggests, most people realize pretty quickly that this is the smarter option. The partner murmurs, it's interesting how calm things get when you stop arguing. None of these are direct commands, but they're all messages wrapped in comfort, coded in suggestion, and delivered like a favor. And it works because the mind wants to fill in the blanks. We respond automatically to implied choices, subtle cues, and conversational hypnosis, especially when we don't realize it's happening. Certain words like because, imagine, remember, you'll start to notice, open the doors of suggestion. They create internal momentum. And once you're inside that narrative, resistance feels unnecessary, even unnatural. You start thinking thoughts that feel spontaneous, making choices that feel self-directed. But your mind has been guided, not forced, not convinced, just gently steered. That's the potency of suggestive language. It sounds like a conversation, but functions like a script. And if the speaker controls the words, they control the rhythm, they control the frame, they control you. But what if suggestion alone wasn't enough? What if they created a situation where you felt compelled to act, not later, not thoughtfully, but right now before logic even had a chance to catch up? Next, we explore creating a sense of urgency, the pressure cooker that shuts down critical thinking and replaces it with obedience. Creating a sense of urgency when pressure replaces thought. What if you made a decision not because it was right, but because you were afraid of what might happen if you hesitated? What if someone could bypass your reasoning entirely by making you believe time was running out? This is the high-pressure tactic of creating a sense of urgency, a psychological trick where the manipulator doesn't argue with your logic, they simply don't give it time to speak. It plays on panic, on scarcity, on the fear of missing something critical. Because when the clock is ticking, your brain shifts into survival mode, and survival doesn't care about nuance. It only cares about acting fast. A salesperson says, this deal is only good for the next 15 minutes. After that, it's gone. A manipulative friend tells you, I need an answer right now. If you have to think about it, don't bother. The cult leader screams that the world is about to end, so now is the time to give everything, leave everyone, and follow without question. It doesn't matter how irrational it sounds. Urgency hijacks the moment, and when urgency takes over, doubt is silenced. Your breathing changes, your focus narrows. You don't reflect, you react. This tactic is especially effective in sales, politics, high-control relationships, and online manipulation. You're told everyone's doing it. This is your only shot. Think too long and it's gone. And the irony? You're so afraid of missing out that you don't even notice what you're missing in the decision itself. Because urgency doesn't just rush you, it shrinks your options. It frames a limited future, act now or lose everything. And when fear of loss outweighs the weight of logic, you obey the pressure just to make it stop. That's the power of urgency. It doesn't manipulate your beliefs, it manipulates your pace. And when your mind is speeding, it's not thinking, it's dodging, reacting, complying. The decision feels like yours, but it was made under duress. But urgency is only one side of pressure. What if the fear wasn't about losing time, but losing connection, status, or something everyone else seems to be enjoying? Next, we step into fear of missing out, or FOMO exploitation, how manipulators use imagined loss to push you into choices you wouldn't otherwise make. Fear of missing out, or FOMO exploitation. When imagined loss drives real decisions, what if someone could make you say yes? Not because you truly wanted something, but because you were afraid you'd regret saying no. What if the fear of missing out was more powerful than the desire to make the right choice? This is the subtle manipulation behind FOMO exploitation. It doesn't sell you the thing itself. It sells you a vision of yourself, left behind, excluded, out of the loop. And that vision terrifies the brain, because FOMO is primal. Being left out of the tribe once meant danger. So now, when someone hints that others are doing something you're not, or that this offer won't come again, your mind doesn't assess it, it reacts. A brand drops a limited edition product with a ticking timer even though the supply is endless. A manipulative friend says, "We're all going without you, but it's fine. We figured you'd say no anyway." An influencer paints a life of constant experiences, making you feel like your quiet reality means you're falling behind. And in that moment, you stop thinking critically. You don't ask, "Do I want this?" You ask, "What happens if I don't?" FOMO preys on imagined futures. It makes you fear a version of yourself who didn't go, didn't buy, didn't join. And that fear doesn't feel hypothetical. It feels urgent, real, and deeply personal. Manipulators love this because they don't need to prove value. They just need to stir discomfort. And once you're in that emotional haze, you'll say yes just to quiet the ache of missing out. But the moment the choice is made, that fear vanishes because it was never about the thing. It was about the feeling. And now you're locked in. That's the danger of FOMO. It doesn't make you want more. It makes you fear less. And when fear becomes the reason for your choices, you're not chasing joy. You're running from emptiness. But emptiness created by someone else so they could sell you the cure. And what if they didn't start with something big? What if they began with something small, harmless, even helpful, just to set the hook? Next, we explore the foot-in-the-door technique, how compliance begins with a whisper and ends with obedience. The foot-in-the-door technique, when small agreements lead to big surrender. What if your willingness to say yes wasn't manipulated all at once, but step by step until your boundaries had quietly disappeared? What if the biggest manipulations didn't begin with pressure, but with a tiny, reasonable request? This is the creeping strategy behind the foot-in-the-door technique. It's not about shock. It's not about demand. It's about starting small, so small you don't feel the shift, and then escalating once you've said yes. And it works because of something hardwired into human psychology. We want to stay consistent. Once we agree to something, especially publicly, we subconsciously want our future actions to match that agreement. Even if the next step is bigger, even if it makes us uncomfortable. The salesperson asks for just your email, then a few questions, then your time, then your money. The manipulator in a relationship asks for one compromise, then another until you're living by their terms and calling it love. A political movement asks for a simple show of support, then demands actions, loyalty, and silence when things go too far. Each step alone might seem harmless, even rational, but when stacked, they form a staircase, one that leads you far from where you started. And by the time you pause to question it, your past agreement is already working against you. You tell yourself, "Well, I've already come this far. I don't want to seem inconsistent. Maybe this is still okay." But each yes isn't just a moment. It's leverage. And for the manipulator, it's evidence that you'll keep going, because they don't need to push hard, they just need you to keep walking. That's the danger of this technique. It feels like progress, like you're just being helpful, or agreeable, or loyal, but piece by piece, you surrender more than you ever would if they'd asked for it all at once. The trick isn't in what they take, it's in how slowly they take it. But what if someone flipped the script? What if they started with something outrageous just to make their real demand feel small by comparison? From subtle escalation to strategic extremes, we now move to the door-in-the-face technique, how rejection becomes the setup for surrender. The door-in-the-face technique, when rejection sets you up to say yes. What if saying no didn't shut the door but actually opened it wider? What if your refusal wasn't the end of the manipulation but the beginning of it? This is the twisted elegance of the door-in-the-face technique, a persuasion strategy that flips the script. Ask for something outrageous first, then follow it with what you really wanted all along. And suddenly that second request feels reasonable, even generous. You think you've negotiated. You think you've stood your ground. But you were never meant to agree to the first offer. It was bait. The trap was the compromise. A manipulative friend asks to borrow a large sum of money. When you say no, they immediately pivot. Well, can you just cover this small bill instead? A child asks to stay out all night. You say no, then they ask for midnight. You agree, grateful they've compromised. A boss suggests working both Saturday and Sunday. You push back, and they say, all right, just Saturday then. You sigh in relief. But you've still lost your weekend. And here's what's happening beneath the surface. You're experiencing reciprocal guilt. Because they lowered their request, you feel pressured to meet them halfway, even if halfway is still beyond your limit. The first ask softens you. It disorients you, and the second ask rides in on the wave of relief. You say yes, not because it's right, but because it's not as bad as what came before. That comparison is the real tool, not the request itself. And once you've said yes to the second offer, you feel like a reasonable person, like you've been fair, like you've won. But you didn't win. You were walked to a destination you never intended to visit by a route designed to make it feel like your idea. That's the trap of the door in the face. It makes surrender feel like strength. You think you've drawn a boundary, but it was exactly where they wanted it all along. Because when rejection is part of the plan, resistance is just another step toward yes. And sometimes, they won't stop there. What if, even after you agreed, they changed the terms after you were already committed? From false compromises to quiet betrayal, we now move into lowballing, how manipulators seal the deal and then rewrite it. Lowballing. When the real cost comes after you say yes. What if you agreed to something that felt fair, only to realize the deal had changed, but you stayed anyway? What if someone offered you exactly what you wanted, only to quietly rewrite the terms once you were already invested? This is the deceptive tactic of lowballing. It begins with a simple premise. Offer something appealing, easy, or low risk to gain commitment. Then, once that commitment is secured, raise the cost. It's bait and switch with a psychological twist. Because you're not being tricked into accepting something new, you're being manipulated into sticking with something worse, because walking away now feels harder than staying. A car dealership quotes a great price. You agree. Later they realize the financing changed. The price is higher, but you've already spent hours there, and you cave. A job promises flexibility and creative freedom. After you accept, the micromanagement begins. But now you're locked in. A partner presents themselves as patient, supportive, easygoing. But after emotional attachment forms, the expectations shift. The rules change. The patience disappears. Lowballing works because of commitment bias, the psychological pressure to stay consistent with what we've already agreed to. You think, I've already come this far. Backing out now would be overreacting. Maybe I misunderstood the original terms. But you didn't. The deal changed. And now you're in damage control, justifying a choice that no longer resembles what you signed up for. The manipulator counts on your discomfort, on your politeness, on your hope that things will go back to how they were in the beginning. But that beginning? It was just a strategy. That's the quiet danger of lowballing. It doesn't pressure you to say yes. It pressures you to stay yes. And by the time you realize the cost has climbed, you've already built a reason to keep paying it. Not because it's worth it, but because you told yourself it was. But what if they didn't even need to convince you directly? What if everyone around you was already convinced? And that was enough to make you follow. From shifting agreements to shifting crowds, we now enter bandwagon effect manipulation. How the illusion of popularity becomes pressure to conform. Bandwagon effect manipulation, when popularity becomes pressure. What if you didn't believe something because it made sense, but simply because it seemed like everyone else already did? What if the fear of being left out was enough to make you fall in line? This is the pull of bandwagon effect manipulation, a tactic that doesn't win arguments or prove a point. It simply says, join us, because everyone else already has. It works because human beings are social creatures. We scan for safety in numbers. And the more people we see nodding, clapping, agreeing, the more certain we become that we should be doing the same. Manipulators use this instinct to create momentum, not through facts, but through appearances. A product is labeled bestseller, even if the sales are manufactured or manipulated. A social movement pushes a hashtag or slogan that's catchy and viral, even if the message behind it is empty. In high-control groups, the leader presents themselves as universally admired, always quoting vague others who agree. Everyone's been saying how right I am. And when you feel like you're the only one not clapping, not cheering, not participating, you begin to question yourself. You ask, am I missing something? Am I overthinking this? Why does everyone else seem so sure? And that doubt is all it takes. Because once you feel like the outsider, the cost of nonconformity rises, and joining the crowd feels safer than standing alone. But here's the truth. The crowd may not be real. The agreement may be staged. The everyone you think you're following might be nothing more than an illusion created to pressure you into silence. That's the danger of the bandwagon. It doesn't argue, it doesn't explain, it doesn't prove, it just moves fast and dares you not to jump on. And in that rush, you stop asking if the direction is right, you just run so you're not left behind. But once you're inside that crowd, what happens when questions arise? What if you still feel uncertain, but the only way to find peace is to choose something, anything just to end the discomfort? Next, we explore exploiting the need for closure, how discomfort is used to rush you into choices you might never have made on your own. Exploiting the need for closure, when uncertainty becomes the weapon. What if the manipulator didn't offer comfort, clarity, or control, but instead used your craving for those things to control you? What if the real pressure wasn't what they told you, but the silence, confusion, and loose ends they left hanging? This is the psychological manipulation of exploiting the need for closure. A tactic that doesn't try to convince you with certainty. It overwhelms you with uncertainty until any answer feels better than no answer at all. Human beings are wired to seek resolution. We want stories to end, questions to have answers, relationships to make sense. And when something stays open, ambiguous, unresolved, confusing, it creates tension. Manipulators weaponize that tension. They create confusion and then offer the very thing you're desperate for: closure. But it's not real clarity, it's control, disguised as relief. A toxic partner causes emotional chaos, then ends the fight with a tearful explanation that blames you, but at least now the conversation is done. A cult floods new members with overwhelming doctrine, then offers a single simple truth to hold on to: just trust the leader. A high-pressure boss refuses to give clear instructions, then criticizes the result, and the employee ends up begging for more direction. In every case, the manipulator creates disorder, then offers to clean it up. And because your brain wants closure more than truth, you'll accept any resolution, just to end the psychological noise. The trick isn't to make you believe, it's to make you tired, confused, unsettled, until certainty becomes more important than accuracy, and surrender becomes more appealing than staying in the tension. That's the power of this manipulation. It hijacks your need for clarity and sells it back to you at the cost of your independence. Because when you're uncomfortable long enough, you'll say yes to anything that promises relief, even if the answer is a lie. But what if they didn't just create one big push, but instead wore you down with tiny, constant pressures? What if every little interaction, every comment, every glance was designed to move you just a little closer to surrender? Next, we explore micromanipulation. How control is built through dozens of moments you barely notice. Micromanipulation. When control comes in tiny, unseen doses. What if the manipulation wasn't obvious? What if it didn't come in dramatic speeches, grand demands, or open threats, but in quiet, repeated moments that seem too small to fight? This is the slow erosion of micromanipulation. It's a technique where control is never seized all at once. It's built brick by brick, through glances, pauses, word choices, and moments that don't look like anything at all. No single act feels like manipulation. Each one could be explained away. You wonder, maybe I'm overthinking it. That didn't sound that bad. It's just a joke. But that's how it works. By keeping each interaction just below the threshold of confrontation, the manipulator stays hidden while your confidence is slowly reshaped. They give compliments that are slightly off. You look good today. Finally got some sleep? They pause just a second too long when you say something, making you second-guess your words. They offer support, but always with a condition. Of course I'll help. That's what I do, take care of people like you. Nothing is overt. Nothing alone would hold up in an argument, but over time, the pattern emerges, and so does the cost. You begin to question yourself more. You apologize when you haven't done anything wrong. You walk into the room already adjusting your mood, and you stop noticing that you're adjusting at all. Because micromanipulation doesn't provoke you into reacting, it trains you into complying. It makes obedience feel natural, even polite. And it disguises control as subtle social pressure. It can happen in relationships, in workplaces, in groups, or even in one-on-one friendships. It doesn't leave bruises or ultimatums, just doubt. And that doubt grows until you no longer need to be controlled. You do it to yourself. That's the insidious power of micromanipulation. It never feels like a fight, but you still end up losing. Not all at once, but piece by piece, thought by thought, smile by smile. Because when control is built quietly, there's no moment to resist, only a gradual surrender. But what if they didn't want you to surrender just yet? What if they wanted you to stay restless, unfinished, slightly agitated, so you'd keep coming back? Next, we explore the Zeigarnik Effect. How leaving things incomplete makes your mind crave closure, even from your manipulator. The Zeigarnik Effect, when unfinished business becomes a chain. What if the most powerful way to keep you hooked wasn't by giving you answers, but by never quite finishing the story? What if your mind kept circling back, not because of what you were told, but because of what was left unsaid? This is the subtle psychological grip of the Zeigarnik Effect, a cognitive phenomenon where your brain fixates on incomplete tasks, unresolved emotions, or unfinished conversations, far more than the ones that are closed. What's open demands your attention, and manipulators use this to perfection. They don't resolve the fight. They don't clarify the confusion. They don't finish the conversation. Instead, they walk away. They go silent. They change the subject. They say, "Let's not do this right now." And suddenly, you're the one chasing closure. You're replaying the last sentence in your head. You're composing texts you'll never send. You're waiting, worrying, wondering, trying to complete the story so you can move on. But you never get that completion, because the longer it stays open, the tighter their grip becomes. A manipulative partner ends an argument with "believe whatever you want," and you spiral trying to decode what that meant. A boss gives you vague criticism with no direction for improvement, leaving you anxious and desperate to prove yourself. A cult leader delivers a cryptic warning in a sermon, never explaining it, but ensuring everyone keeps seeking answers from them. The Zeigarnik Effect isn't about logic, it's about psychological itch. The tension of unfinished emotional business keeps you in a loop, not because you want them, but because your mind wants resolution. And that desire, that mental discomfort, is now in their control. That's the quiet trap of the Zeigarnik Effect. You don't cling to the manipulator because of who they are. You cling to the version of the story your brain still hasn't finished. You stay not for love, but for closure. And when they know that, they never need to slam the door. They just leave it cracked. But what if the manipulator didn't just leave you seeking closure? What if they shaped your identity through nothing more than their belief in you, good or bad, and watched as you lived up to it? Next, we explore the Pygmalion Effect, how expectations alone can sculpt behavior. The Pygmalion Effect, when expectations become self-fulfilling traps. What if someone didn't have to force you to change because they simply believed you would? What if their expectations, spoken or unspoken, slowly shaped the way you saw yourself until you became exactly what they assumed you'd be? This is the haunting subtlety of the Pygmalion Effect, a psychological phenomenon where people tend to live up or down to the expectations placed on them. When others believe in your potential, you rise. When they expect you to fail, you often do, and manipulators understand this far too well. They don't need to scream or threaten. They just plant the idea, "You're always the difficult one. I knew you wouldn't understand. You've never been great with responsibility, have you?" Over time, those phrases aren't just judgments. They become mirrors. You begin to identify with the roles you're given, not because they're true, but because they're consistent. Because people treat you accordingly, and eventually so do you. It can look like these scenarios. A student performs poorly because a teacher expects nothing more. An employee stops contributing because their manager constantly overlooks them. A partner slowly accepts blame for every conflict because they've been framed as too emotional or never satisfied. But it also happens in the other direction. When a manipulator builds you up, but only in ways that serve their control. They praise you when you're obedient. They tell you how strong, loyal, or selfless you are, but only when those traits benefit them. So you strive to maintain that image, even if it hurts. You try to be who they say you are, and in doing so you drift further from who you actually are. That's the power of the Pygmalion Effect. Expectation becomes architecture. It doesn't demand change. It just predicts it, and then patiently waits. And the more often you hear who you are, the harder it becomes to remember who you were before the voice got inside your head. But what if they didn't stop there? What if they could twist your failures into victories, reframing your worst moments until you no longer trusted your own sense of reality? Next, we explore reframing failure, how even your losses can be used against you, with a smile. Reframing failure. When losing is painted as progress. What if every time something went wrong it wasn't acknowledged, but rebranded? What if failure wasn't denied, but reinterpreted so skillfully that you stopped recognizing it as failure at all? This is the deceptive brilliance of reframing failure. A manipulation tactic where loss, pain, and mistakes aren't corrected. They're spun, not to help you heal, but to make you doubt your judgment, to keep you committed to something that isn't working because you've been told it's all part of the process. Manipulators don't apologize when they should. They reframe. That wasn't a mistake. It was a learning experience. You're stronger now because of what we went through. This shows how committed you are. See how much we've grown? And just like that, the hurt becomes a milestone. The dysfunction becomes a badge of honor. You're no longer allowed to be upset because look how far you've come. You're discouraged from leaving because why walk away after everything you've invested? You start to believe that all the setbacks, heartbreaks, and red flags must have a purpose. That this path, though painful, is still leading somewhere meaningful. But it's not. It's circling. And every time you try to name what's really happening, the manipulator offers a new label. Not a lie, but a distortion. Just enough to blur the lines between reality and narrative. And the longer you stay, the more you're praised for your resilience. Your endurance becomes your prison. Because now you're not just enduring hardship, you're proving something to yourself, even if that proof was planted by someone else. That's the trap of reframed failure. It dresses wounds in wisdom so you won't treat them as injuries. It turns harm into growth, manipulation into transformation, and it keeps you chasing validation in a story where your suffering is the only way to earn it. But what if that story wasn't even about you? What if the manipulator made sure that one good trait, one charming quality was enough to make everyone forget the rest? Next, we explore the halo effect, how one bright light can blind you to the shadows. The halo effect. When one good trait hides everything else. What if someone didn't need to be kind, honest, or fair? They just needed to seem charming. What if one impressive quality could blind you to everything they were doing wrong? This is the quiet illusion of the halo effect. A cognitive bias where our impression of one positive trait causes us to assume other unrelated traits are positive too. It's not logic, it's instinct, and it's a gift to manipulators, because if they appear confident, we assume they're competent. If they're attractive, we assume they're trustworthy. If they speak with authority, we assume they know what they're talking about. And the result? We ignore red flags. We downplay inconsistencies. We rewrite reality to fit the image. A charismatic leader delivers powerful speeches, so no one questions the darker motives behind their policies. A successful entrepreneur is admired for their drive, so their toxic behavior is excused as passion. A manipulative partner is funny, generous, or talented, so when they belittle, lie, or disappear, you forgive it, because you've already decided who they are. And the worst part? The halo doesn't just distort how you see them, it changes how you see yourself. If someone so good treats you poorly, you must be the problem. If others praise them, and you feel hurt, maybe you're too sensitive. That's how the trap tightens. You trust the image, not the behavior. And even when their actions contradict the halo, your mind struggles to accept it, because it's easier to bend reality than to admit your judgment might have been wrong. That's the danger of the halo effect. It doesn't just elevate someone, it shields them. And that shield can become bulletproof if you keep mistaking charm for character, confidence for care, and performance for truth. But what if you were never even given time to see clearly in the first place? What if they rushed your decisions before your logic had a chance to catch up? From illusions of greatness to weapons of speed, we now step into time constraints, how urgency can trap you in someone else's timeline. Time constraints. When you're rushed into surrender. What if you were never given time to think clearly? Because thinking was the one thing your manipulator couldn't afford. What if the pressure you felt wasn't about the situation, but about the clock ticking louder than your intuition? This is the calculated pressure of time constraints, a manipulation tactic where urgency is weaponized to push you into decisions before your reason can fully wake up. It's not always about fear. Sometimes it's urgency dressed as opportunity. Sometimes it's disguised as efficiency, decisiveness, momentum. But at its core, it's about robbing you of space to reflect. A salesperson tells you the deal expires today only, forcing a snap commitment. A toxic partner demands immediate forgiveness, saying, "We can't move forward unless you let this go right now." A recruiter pressures you to accept a job before you've had time to consider other options. A high-control group urges you to act on faith because overthinking leads to doubt. Time limits shut down dialogue. They say, if you have to think about it, maybe you're not ready. You're being difficult. You're going to lose everything if you don't act right now. And that pressure triggers your survival instinct. You react instead of reason. You agree not because it's right, but because silence, hesitation, or reflection feel like threats. This tactic is especially dangerous when paired with other manipulations, a false sense of scarcity, a fabricated consequence, or an artificial deadline that forces you to move fast and regret slowly. And later when things unravel, you'll wonder, why didn't I wait? Why did I feel so rushed? Why didn't I listen to that small voice telling me to pause? The answer is simple. You were never supposed to pause. You were meant to comply before the truth had time to surface. That's the trap of time constraints. They don't give you less choice. They give you less clarity. And when you feel like you're out of time, you'll accept almost anything just to make the pressure stop. But what if that pressure wasn't just about time? What if they could make a bad option look good, simply by placing it next to something worse? Next, we explore the contrast principle, how perception is shaped not by value, but by comparison. The contrast principle, when bad looks good next to worse. What if you said yes to something unfair, not because it seemed perfect, but because it seemed better than the other option? What if the manipulator didn't improve the offer, they just lowered your expectations first? This is the strategic distortion of the contrast principle, a manipulation tactic where our judgment is shaped not by what something is, but by what it's compared to. In other words, the same thing can seem awful or appealing, depending entirely on what comes before it. Manipulators use this not to change reality, but to warp your perception of it. A manager offers you an exhausting workload, then cuts it down slightly, making you feel grateful for a schedule that's still unreasonable. A manipulative partner is cold and distant, then suddenly kind for a day. Compared to the silence, you experience it as love. A cult demands total obedience, but because it's less harsh than your previous group, you interpret it as freedom. It's a psychological sleight of hand. You're not evaluating what's fair. You're evaluating what's better than what came before. And this creates a dangerous trap. You start to feel lucky, relieved, even loyal to someone who's still manipulating you, just more gently than before. The contrast principle is especially effective when paired with time pressure, fatigue, or emotional overload. Because when your baseline is misery, even mild mistreatment feels like a gift. And soon, your standards shift. You stop asking what's right or healthy. You start asking what's tolerable. And the manipulator keeps control, not by giving you something good, but by making sure it's not quite as bad as the alternative. That's the danger of the contrast principle. It doesn't need to convince you something is good. It just needs to make everything else look worse. And once you accept pain as your baseline, even crumbs of kindness feel like a feast. But what if they went one step further? What if they could make you overvalue something? Not because it was rare or useful, but simply because you built it yourself. Next, we explore the IKEA effect, how effort creates attachment, even when it shouldn't. The IKEA effect, when effort becomes attachment. What if the harder you worked on something, the more likely you were to believe it was worth keeping, even if it wasn't? What if your investment of time, energy, or emotion blinded you to the truth about what you'd built or who you'd built it with? This is the psychological trap of the IKEA effect, named after the furniture brand where you assemble the product yourself, leading you to value it more than if it came pre-made. It's a harmless bias when building shelves, but in the hands of a manipulator, it becomes a powerful way to keep you stuck in something broken. Because when you put in the work, the long conversations, the compromises, the forgiveness, the effort, you don't want to believe it was for nothing. So you convince yourself it's worth it, that they are all worth it, that the relationship, the job, the group, the cause deserves your loyalty because of how hard you've worked to hold it together. A toxic partner watches you do all the emotional labor and rewards you just enough to make you feel like progress is being made. A manipulative job keeps you overworked and underpaid, but you've built systems, trained others, and taken pride in your role, so you tell yourself you can't walk away now. A controlling group puts you through endless steps, tasks, and rituals, so that by the time you're allowed in, your identity is tied to what it cost you. And the more you sacrifice, the harder it becomes to leave. Not because things are improving, but because leaving would mean admitting it might never have been worth it. So you stay, you justify, you cling to the idea that your effort has created something valuable, even when it's only created exhaustion. That's the quiet trap of the IKEA effect. It turns your labor into loyalty, and the manipulator doesn't have to give you something meaningful. They just have to let you build it so you'll convince yourself it means something. But what if they could control not just what you built, but how you chose between what was offered, even when both options were designed to steer you the same way? Next, we explore the decoy effect, how fake choices are used to funnel you into a decision you never really made. The decoy effect, when fake choices lead you exactly where they want. What if the choice you made wasn't really yours, but carefully engineered to feel like it was? What if one of your options only existed to make the other one look better? This is the manipulative strategy of the decoy effect, a psychological tactic where an inferior third option is introduced, not to be chosen, but to steer you toward the decision the manipulator wants. It's not about freedom of choice, it's about the illusion of it. Here's how it works. Imagine you're choosing between two options. Option A is cheap but basic. Option B is expensive but loaded with features. You hesitate. Then suddenly, option C appears, priced just slightly below B, but with far fewer benefits. Now, option B looks like a no-brainer. You choose it, not because it's perfect, but because you were nudged. That's the decoy. It's not there to compete. It's there to compare. And manipulators use this in all kinds of context. A manipulative boss gives you two projects. One is overwhelming, one is just demanding. You pick the second, grateful for the easier task. A partner makes two suggestions, one obviously unfair, the other subtly selfish. You choose the second, feeling like you compromised. A marketing campaign adds another overpriced version of a product, which has already two versions, to push you toward their preferred choice in the middle. You feel in control. You feel smart, but your environment was engineered to guide your hand. And what's most unsettling is how effective this is even when people are aware of it. Because the brain doesn't just want to choose, it wants to feel like it made the best choice. And when given a bad option to compare, you stop questioning the structure of the game itself. That's the deception of the decoy effect. It gives you the power to decide, while quietly rigging the context around you. You don't just pick the outcome they want, you thank them for making it so obvious. But what if they could go even further, not just shaping your choices, but making your belief in those choices change your actual experience? Next, we explore the placebo effect, how expectation alone can become manipulation, even without a single lie. The placebo effect. When belief becomes its own manipulation. What if you didn't need a real solution to feel better, just the belief that something was helping you? What if your mind did the work of healing or calming or trusting, not because of what was given, but because of what you were told to expect? This is the curious and dangerously useful mechanism of the placebo effect. Originally observed in medicine, it refers to the phenomenon where a person experiences real change after receiving something that has no therapeutic value, simply because they believe it will work. But outside of medicine, manipulators have found ways to turn this effect into a psychological tool. They don't need to offer real change. They don't need to fix anything. They just need to give you the appearance of effort, wrapped in the promise that things are getting better. A toxic partner brings flowers after a fight, not to change, but so you believe the dynamic is improving. A boss praises your work just enough to keep you going, though nothing structural ever changes. A high-control group gives you a spiritual breakthrough after weeks of confusion and fatigue, restoring your faith in the system they control. None of it is real resolution. But the expectation of progress soothes you, and your brain fills in the rest. You tell yourself, this time is different. They're trying. I can feel things shifting, but nothing's shifted except your perception. And because you feel better, you stop asking why. You stop pushing. You stay. The manipulator doesn't rely on results. They rely on hope. Hope that's reinforced by your own brain chemistry. And the longer that hope sticks around, the less you question whether it's grounded in anything real. That's the trap of the placebo effect in manipulation. It doesn't require a lie, only belief. And when your mind convinces you that change is happening, you become easier to pacify and harder to free. But what if instead of promising gain, they triggered your fear of loss? What if they knew your mind values what it already has far more than what it could gain, and they used that against you? Next, we explore loss aversion, how the fear of letting go can overpower your will to walk away. Loss aversion. When the fear of letting go keeps you trapped, what if the reason you stayed wasn't because things were good, but because you were terrified of losing what little you had? What if the manipulator didn't offer you more, they just made you believe that leaving meant losing everything? This is the powerful psychological pull of loss aversion, a well-documented bias where we feel the pain of loss far more intensely than we feel the joy of gain. In other words, we'll go to greater lengths to avoid losing something than to earn something better. And for manipulators, that's not just psychology, it's leverage. They don't need to offer real happiness. They just need to convince you that leaving means giving something up. You'll never find someone who understands you like I do. After all this time, you're just going to throw it away? You've worked so hard, don't quit now. They frame your current pain as an investment. They turn the relationship, the job, the belief system into a sunk cost. And suddenly, walking away feels like failure. Even when you're exhausted, even when you know better, you hesitate, not because you want to stay, but because you're afraid of what you'll lose if you go. And here's the trick, they don't have to keep giving you anything. They just have to remind you of what you might be giving up. A version of them that once existed, a dream that never quite came true, a life you imagined but were never actually living. So you stay for the possibility. The what if. You cling not to what is, but to what was, or worse, what never was at all. That's the quiet grip of loss aversion. It doesn't ask you to believe in the future. It just makes you fear walking away from the past. And in that fear, your freedom becomes the one thing you feel you can't afford. But what if they went deeper still? What if they didn't just use words or pressure, but physical contact itself, weaponized as a tool of comfort, guilt, or dominance? Next, we explore the power of touch, how even the simplest contact can be used to manipulate emotion and override resistance. The power of touch, when contact is used to control. What if a hand on your shoulder could silence your doubt? What if a hug, a brush of the arm, or a reassuring pat was less about comfort and more about control? This is the often overlooked influence of the power of touch, a psychological tool where physical contact is used, not just to connect, but to influence, disarm, or override emotional boundaries. Touch, at its best, is a gesture of intimacy, support, and trust. It lowers cortisol, increases oxytocin, and helps people feel safe. But in the hands of a manipulator, it becomes a silent language of dominance. They don't shout. They don't argue. They simply place a hand on your back at the right moment. Take your hand when you're hesitant. Hold you close when they sense you pulling away, and you feel calmer, reassured. Not because the situation changed, but because your body responded before your mind had time to process. A manipulative leader uses touch to create a false sense of personal connection with followers, so dissent feels like betrayal. A toxic partner escalates a fight, then ends it with a long, tender embrace, so your nervous system relaxes, even if the words were never resolved. A salesperson gently touches your arm while pitching an offer, increasing the odds you'll agree, not logically, but neurologically. The danger is subtle, because unlike words, touch bypasses skepticism. It's primal. And if you've been conditioned to associate touch with love or apology, even an abuser's hand can feel like safety. Over time, it becomes a pattern. The worse things get, the more you crave the touch that follows, and the more you equate that touch with comfort, even when it's part of the very cycle that's hurting you. That's the hidden force of the power of touch. It doesn't have to say anything to change how you feel. And when feelings override logic, even the most harmful dynamics can start to feel like home. But what if they didn't stop at calming you with touch? What if they got you to agree to things just by making you speak first? From physical presence to verbal traps, we now step into the foot-in-the-mouth effect, how small talk can lead to silent surrender. The foot-in-the-mouth effect, when small talk becomes a silent agreement. What if a casual "how are you" wasn't just politeness, but the first step in getting you to say yes? What if just answering a simple question made you more likely to comply without ever realizing why? This is the quiet mechanism behind the foot-in-the-mouth effect, a psychological trick. We're getting someone to engage in small, seemingly harmless conversation makes them more likely to agree to a later request. It's disarming, it's charming, and it's deeply manipulative when used with intention. It begins with connection, usually something mild, personal, or socially expected. "Hey, how are you today? Beautiful weather, isn't it? Hope your day's going well." And when you respond, even politely, you've opened the door. Your defenses drop, you've entered a rhythm of agreement. And now, saying yes to the next thing feels easier than breaking that rhythm. A fundraiser chats kindly, then asks for a donation. You feel guilty saying no after being so friendly. A manipulative coworker warms you up with jokes and flattery, then casually requests you cover their shift. A partner begins with affection and softness before slipping in something selfish, counting on your emotional openness to smooth the way. And because you've already agreed on tone, on energy, on social flow, rejecting their actual request feels harsher than it is. Not because the request is fair, but because you've already said yes to everything around it. This tactic works because humans are deeply social. We don't just avoid conflict, we avoid breaking connection. So once you've engaged, even the smallest form of connection becomes a lever to open the bigger door. That's the subtle trap of the foot-in-the-mouth effect. It turns politeness into permission. And once you've smiled, laughed, or said "I'm good," you're no longer just responding to the person, you're managing the relationship, which makes saying no feel like a violation, even when it's the right thing to do. But what if the manipulation didn't rely on charm or conversation at all? What if it preyed on your very sense of ownership, making you overvalue what you already have, just so you'd never let it go? Next, we explore the endowment effect, how your mind turns the familiar into the untouchable. The endowment effect, when what's yours feels too valuable to lose. What if the simple fact that something belonged to you made it feel more valuable than it actually was? What if the manipulator didn't have to convince you to keep something because your brain was already doing the convincing for them? This is the deeply rooted psychological bias known as the endowment effect, the tendency for people to place higher value on things simply because they own them. Not because those things are better, more useful, or more meaningful, but because they're ours. It works on objects and ideas and even relationships. And it's incredibly easy to exploit. A manipulative partner doesn't have to treat you well. They just remind you how long you've been together. A controlling employer counts on the fact that you've built your career here to keep you from leaving, even in the face of mistreatment. A cult doesn't have to offer proof. It just points to the years, the effort, the community you'd lose if you walked away. The more time, energy, or emotion you've invested, the harder it is to see clearly. You overvalue the relationship, the belief, the position, not because it's right, but because it's yours. And that ownership creates blindness. You start defending what hurts you. You justify staying by focusing on everything you'd have to give up, not realizing that what you're clinging to is already costing you more than you think. The endowment effect keeps you loyal to pain, to outdated dreams, to identities you've outgrown. Because letting go feels like loss, even if the truth is, you've already lost too much by holding on. That's the grip of the endowment effect. It makes leaving feel like losing. Not because what you have is good, but because it's yours, and that illusion of ownership becomes the very thing that traps you. But what if the manipulator wasn't content with keeping you loyal? What if they wanted full control by pushing beyond bias, beyond belief, straight into your ability to think freely at all? Next, we step into mind control, how advanced psychological tactics are used to override will, reshape identity, and break resistance. Mind control, when thought is no longer your own. What if the choices you made, the words you spoke, even the beliefs you held, weren't really yours? What if someone had slowly overwritten your inner voice with theirs, so subtly that you didn't notice it happening until you couldn't tell where you ended and they began? This is the terrifying reality of mind control, not a sci-fi fantasy of chips or hypnotic beams, but a real layered process of psychological conditioning, where manipulators override your will through repetition, isolation, confusion, and emotional dependency. And they do it step by step, never with force, always with familiarity. Mind control is rarely sudden. It's a slow erosion. Your thoughts are questioned. Your doubts are reframed. Your support systems are cut away. And your sense of reality is gently but relentlessly replaced. It's seen in high control groups, abusive relationships, radicalization pipelines, and even some workplaces. The method is always the same. Break your confidence, fill the void, seal the exit. They bombard you with conflicting information until you stop trying to understand. They isolate you, physically or emotionally, so their voice is the only one left. They reward obedience, punish dissent, and make every escape route feel dangerous. And then they give you clarity, their clarity. Soon, you stop asking questions. You stop trusting yourself. You repeat their phrases, defend their choices, believe their version of the truth, even when it contradicts your own lived experience. And the scariest part? You feel calm. You feel certain, because that's how deep it goes. True mind control doesn't feel like domination. It feels like peace. But it's not peace. It's surrender. That's the darkness of mind control. It doesn't bind your body. It reshapes your reality until the bars are inside your mind, and you thank your captor for keeping you safe. But what if the manipulator didn't always dominate? What if they got what they wanted by pretending to be helpless, foolish, or naive until you lowered your guard completely? Next, we explore the power of playing dumb, how feigned ignorance becomes a tool of quiet control. The power of playing dumb, when pretending not to know puts you in control. What if someone gained power over you not by being smarter or louder, but by acting like they didn't understand anything at all? What if their confusion wasn't real but a mask designed to shift responsibility, avoid blame, or control your behavior? This is the deceptive tactic known as the power of playing dumb. It's not about weakness. It's not about innocence. It's about strategic incompetence, using the appearance of ignorance as a shield, a weapon, or a trap. Manipulators who use this tactic know exactly what they're doing. They pretend they didn't realize, didn't mean it that way, or don't really get what you're so upset about. And the moment you confront them, They disarm you with a shrug and a blank stare. A toxic coworker always forgets deadlines, but never forgets to claim credit. A manipulative partner pretends they didn't understand your boundary. Again, then apologizes without changing. An abuser feigns confusion when called out, turning your anger into guilt. I didn't know it mattered so much to you. And what happens? You step in, you explain, you fix, you forgive. You do the emotional labor while they float just beneath the line of accountability. It's especially effective because it seems harmless. They're not yelling. They're not pushing. They're just confused. So if you push harder, you look cruel. If you walk away, you look impatient. If you get frustrated, they sigh and say you're too intense. And over time, you lower your expectations. You stop asking for more. You do things yourself because it's easier than trying to get through to someone who's just not getting it. But they get it. They always did. Playing dumb was never about what they didn't understand. It was about making sure you gave more, questioned less, and eventually stopped resisting at all. That's the silent strength of this manipulation. It lets them stay in control while you exhaust yourself explaining the rules they've already learned. And by the time you realize the game is rigged, you spent all your energy trying to teach someone who was never actually listening. But what if they didn't just use feigned ignorance to control your present? What if they twisted your entire past into a reason you should stay, even when you knew it was time to go? Next, we step into the sunk cost trap, where the time, energy, and emotion you've already given become the very chains that hold you in place. The sunk cost trap, when what you've given up keeps you from letting go. What if the reason you stayed wasn't because things were improving, but because of how much you'd already given to something that isn't working? What if the pain you've endured became the very reason you convinced yourself to keep enduring more? This is the psychological chokehold of the sunk cost trap, a mental bias where you feel compelled to stick with something simply because you've already invested time, effort, or emotion into it. Even when it's failing, even when it's hurting you, even when it's clearly over, manipulators thrive in this space. They don't need to offer hope. They don't need to change. They just need to remind you of how much you've already given. You're really going to walk away after everything we've been through? Don't throw away what we've built. You've sacrificed so much. Don't let it be for nothing. But what they're really saying is this: let your past trap you in a future you didn't choose. And it works, because humans are loss-averse. We hate wasting time, energy, love. So we double down. We give more. We try harder. Not because it's right, but because we're terrified of admitting it might have all been wrong. You tell yourself the next version will be better. You romanticize the early days. You hang on to a dream that's turned into an anchor, believing that if you just endure a little longer, your sacrifice will finally pay off. But all it pays is more pain, more confusion, more time you'll never get back. That's the cruelty of the sunk cost trap. It turns your history into a weapon, and the longer you've fought to hold on, the harder it becomes to admit that maybe the bravest thing left is letting go. But what if the manipulator didn't use your past against you? What if they used their pain instead, offering you glimpses of vulnerability not to build trust, but to gain power? Next, we explore weaponized vulnerability, how tears, trauma, and tenderness can be twisted into control. Weaponized vulnerability, when their wounds are used to control you. What if someone's pain wasn't a plea for empathy, but a strategy to keep you silent, guilty, and compliant? What if the tears you saw weren't a sign of sincerity, but a shield to protect their power? This is the subtle, manipulative tactic of weaponized vulnerability, where someone uses their own suffering, insecurities, or past trauma not to heal, but to hijack your compassion, to twist your empathy into obedience, to make you feel responsible not only for their feelings, but for their actions. At first, it's disarming. You see their pain, you soften. They open up just enough to keep you close. You know, I've been through a lot. This is just how I am because of what I went through. I act this way because I'm scared of losing you. And suddenly, the conversation changes. It's no longer about what they did to hurt you. It's about what hurt them. You find yourself comforting the person who just wounded you. You pause your boundaries. You swallow your truth because they're crying and you're kind. But here's the cost. Every time you try to stand up for yourself, their pain gets louder. They don't apologize. They explain. They justify, and you end up feeling like the villain. It doesn't mean their pain isn't real, but pain doesn't excuse harm. And vulnerability that's only used to escape accountability isn't vulnerability, it's control wrapped in softness. Because when you can't say no without guilt, you're not in a relationship, you're in a trap. That's the weaponization of vulnerability. It uses your empathy as a leash, and the more you care, the tighter it pulls. Until love means surrender, and boundaries feel like cruelty. But what if it wasn't just their pain flooding the moment? What if they overwhelmed you emotionally so completely that you stopped thinking and simply shut down? Next, we explore emotional flooding, how chaos becomes a smokescreen for control. Emotional flooding, when overwhelm becomes a weapon. What if the volume, speed, and intensity of someone's emotions weren't spontaneous, but designed to drown out your ability to think? What if they didn't win arguments with logic, but by overwhelming your nervous system until all you could do was submit? This is the destabilizing tactic of emotional flooding, when someone unleashes a wave of intense emotion, not to express how they feel, but to shut you down, shut you up, or shut you out. It's not about resolution. It's about control through chaos. They escalate, their voice rises, their tears pour, their rage erupts, and suddenly the topic you were trying to address is gone, swallowed by panic, guilt, fear, or exhaustion. You bring up something that hurts you, and they immediately start sobbing uncontrollably. Now you're comforting them. You ask a simple question, and they explode into accusations, yelling, slamming doors. You try to express your needs, but they go silent and icy, radiating distress until you back down. It doesn't matter what form it takes. What matters is the result. You stop. You go numb. You freeze. You question whether the issue was even worth raising. And over time, you learn the pattern. Don't bring that up. It'll set them off. Don't express that feeling. It'll just start a fight. Don't ask for clarity. It'll only make things worse. This is how emotional flooding rewires your behavior. You begin avoiding conflict, not because things are better, but because chaos always wins. And the manipulator doesn't have to argue or explain. They just overwhelm. And when you're overwhelmed, you're no longer negotiating, you're surviving. That's the suffocating effect of emotional flooding. It replaces dialogue with intensity and resolution with submission. And the more often it happens, the less safe you feel using your voice at all. But what if they didn't need to scream or cry to keep you confused? What if they created loops, mental traps, where your need for validation always circled back to them? Next, we explore gaslighted validation loops, how doubt becomes the leash that keeps you coming back. Gaslighted validation loops. When doubt becomes the leash, what if every time you questioned something, you were made to feel irrational, overly sensitive, or just plain wrong? And what if the only person who could set you straight was the same one who made you doubt yourself in the first place? This is the mental maze of gaslighted validation loops, a manipulation tactic where you're first gaslit into doubting your reality, then trapped in a cycle of seeking validation from the same person who shattered your confidence in the first place. Unlike straightforward gaslighting, which focuses on distorting your perception, these loops pull you deeper by making you dependent on the manipulator for a sense of clarity and emotional stability. It's a cycle. One they build, and one you begin to depend on. It starts subtly. You bring up a feeling, a boundary, a memory. They say, that never happened. You're overreacting. You always twist things. So you doubt yourself. You feel anxious, uncertain, off balance. And in that disoriented state, you ask them to help you make sense of it. You need reassurance. You need grounding. But what they give you isn't clarity. It's a new version of reality that benefits them. And because you're desperate for peace, you accept it. This is the loop. They cause confusion. You seek answers. They become the source of truth. And your dependency grows. Over time, you stop trusting your instincts. You replay conversations in your head, unsure what was real. You think, maybe it was my fault. Maybe I am too emotional. Maybe I should just check with them first. And that's exactly what they want. You no longer rely on your memory, your perception, or your feelings. You rely on them. It doesn't always come with cruelty. Sometimes it's disguised as care. You know I love you. I just worry when you think like that. I'm only saying this because I want to help you see things clearly. But the result is the same. You stop seeking truth. You start seeking approval. And the more you try to feel sane, the deeper you fall into the very confusion they created. That's the trap of gaslighted validation loops. They build the fire, then hand you the water, but only just enough to keep you dependent and never enough to let you walk away. But what if they didn't just distort your truth? What if they trained you little by little to stop questioning them at all? Next, we explore creating learned obedience, how punishment and reward are used to build quiet submission. Creating learned obedience when resistance is trained out of you. What if you weren't just manipulated into compliance, but trained to believe that obedience was your safest option? What if your silence, your caution, your hesitation to speak up wasn't weakness, but conditioning? This is the chilling effect of creating learned obedience, a long-game manipulation, where your behavior is slowly reshaped through patterns of reward, punishment, and emotional unpredictability. It doesn't feel like control at first. It feels like learning how to keep the peace, how to avoid setting them off, how to survive. It begins with a correction, then a withdrawal, then a punishment that isn't quite named, just delivered quietly. A cold shoulder, a guilt trip, a wave of disappointment. And over time, your brain starts linking resistance with pain. You voice discomfort and suddenly they're hurt or angry. You set a boundary and now they're sulking, blaming, or making you the bad guy. You challenge them and they twist it until you're apologizing. Eventually you stop trying, you stop questioning, you avoid topics, you read their mood before every conversation. And the person you used to be, curious, bold, clear, is replaced by someone who's always scanning, softening, shrinking. They don't need to control you overtly, because now you do it for them. You've been trained to flinch before you speak, to calculate your tone, to over-explain, to second-guess every instinct that once felt natural. And the scariest part? You may not even notice it's happening, because learned obedience often masquerades as maturity, as growth, as figuring out how to get along. But in truth, it's not growth, it's containment, it's learned fear. That's the weight of learned obedience. It turns control into routine, until you forget what it felt like to say no, without bracing for impact. But what if they didn't just train your behavior? What if they controlled what you even had access to know? Next, we explore information withholding, how truth is filtered, delayed, or denied to keep you in the dark and under control. Information withholding, when control is built on what you're not allowed to know. What if you weren't confused because you lacked intelligence, but because someone carefully decided what you were allowed to understand? What if the truth wasn't hidden outright, but rationed just enough to keep you in place, never enough to set you free? This is the calculated strategy of information withholding, A manipulation tactic where the flow of knowledge is controlled like a faucet, turned on or off, to shape your perception, your decisions, and ultimately your dependence. It doesn't look like a lie. It looks like omission, deflection, delay. You ask a question and they say, "You wouldn't understand." You raise a concern and they reply, "It's more complicated than you think." You want to know what's really going on and they say, "Just trust me." And you do, at first, but slowly a fog begins to settle. You notice gaps in the story, contradictions, moments where your gut says something isn't right, but you have no facts to ground that feeling. Because the facts were never given to you, not fully, not clearly, just enough to keep you uncertain, but too unsure to walk away. This tactic is especially powerful in environments where control is normalized, toxic relationships, high-demand groups, workplaces ruled by hierarchy, where need to know becomes a wall that keeps you obedient. The more you ask, the more they act like your questions are the problem. You begin to feel intrusive, paranoid, difficult, so you stop asking, and now they don't even need to withhold information. You've learned to stop seeking it. That's the silent strength of information withholding. It doesn't tell you what to believe. It just narrows your choices until there's only one belief left, theirs. But what if they didn't just keep knowledge from you? What if they made you feel guilty for even wanting to know more, for needing anything at all? Next, we explore manufactured guilt, how shame is crafted and weaponized to keep you small, silent, and stuck. Manufactured guilt, when shame is built from thin air. What if you felt guilty, not because you'd done something wrong, but because someone made you feel like existing was already too much? What if your needs, your boundaries, your emotions were framed as burdens until you apologized for simply being human? This is the emotional trap of manufactured guilt. A manipulation tactic where shame isn't a response to your behavior, it's a tool used to control it. You're not actually wrong, but you're made to feel as if you are. And over time, that guilt becomes automatic. You express a need, and they sigh heavily. You try to rest, and they call you selfish. You say no, and they act wounded. "I just thought you cared more." They don't scream. They imply. They use tone, silence, timing. They play the victim in subtle surgical ways. And you start to shrink, not because they said you were wrong, but because they made you feel like you must be. You apologize for setting a boundary. You over-explain your feelings. You replay conversations in your head, wondering how you could have made it easier for them. And slowly, guilt becomes your reflex. This tactic works especially well on kind, empathetic people, because you want to be good, you want to do the right thing, and they twist that into a leash. Even your healing becomes selfish. Even your silence becomes cruel. Even your absence becomes a betrayal. And the more guilt you carry, the more control they keep, because someone drowning in shame is too tired to rebel, too uncertain to resist, too afraid to believe they deserve better. That's the power of manufactured guilt. It turns decency into obedience, and the deeper it sinks, the more you punish yourself so they don't have to. But what if guilt wasn't used alone? What if every favor, every compliment, every kind gesture came with an invisible price tag? Next, we explore toxic reciprocity, how manipulators keep score, and use your own gratitude to make you comply. Toxic reciprocity, when kindness becomes currency. What if every favor was a transaction? Every compliment a down payment? Every generous act just another item on a growing invisible scorecard, one you didn't know you were being judged by until it was too late? This is the quiet debt of toxic reciprocity, a manipulation tactic where acts of kindness are given not out of care but as leverage. It looks like generosity, it sounds like love, but behind the smile is a ledger, and everything they give will be expected back, with interest. They buy you dinner, then later say, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me. They help you move, and weeks later guilt you into doing something uncomfortable because friends help each other out. They shower you with praise or gifts early in a relationship, only to use that love as a reason you're not allowed to leave. You feel trapped, not by cruelty, but by obligation. By a voice that says, "You owe me. Don't be ungrateful. People would kill to have what I've given you." But the gifts weren't free. The affection wasn't unconditional. It was currency waiting to be cashed in. And if you hesitate to repay it, with time, with energy, with silence, you're made to feel selfish, disloyal, undeserving. This kind of manipulation is insidious because it hides behind virtue. It looks like generosity. It plays the long game. And by the time the debt is called in, you can't tell the difference between kindness and control. You stay not because you want to, but because you've been made to feel like leaving would be stealing. That's the trap of toxic reciprocity. It weaponizes good deeds to bind you with guilt. And by the time you realize you're being collected like a favor, you've already stopped saying no. But what if they didn't even need to say anything at all? What if they could control the situation completely by saying nothing, by doing nothing and forcing you to live in the silence they created? Next, we explore weaponized silence, how quiet becomes punishment, and absence becomes a tool of domination. Weaponized silence, when quiet becomes a cage. What if the loudest form of control didn't involve shouting, but absolute, calculated silence? What if someone could dominate a relationship not by speaking, but by vanishing, withdrawing, or simply refusing to respond until you broke first? This is the chilling tactic of weaponized silence, a form of emotional manipulation where silence is not peace, it's punishment. It's not absence, it's control, and it's designed to make you anxious, ashamed, and eager to please. At first, it seems like someone just needs space, but then they disappear in the middle of a conversation. They ghost you after you express a boundary. They go cold and distant, not to reflect, but to punish. You text, you apologize, you question yourself, you spiral, wondering what you did wrong, and when they finally respond, it's never with clarity. It's with more ambiguity. A vague reply, a passive-aggressive sigh, a dismissive "I've just been busy." And you breathe a little easier, not because the problem is resolved, but because the silence is over. You've been trained to crave the sound of their voice, even if that voice is unfair, manipulative, or cold. Over time, you learn the rules. You avoid topics that might trigger withdrawal. You tiptoe around honesty. You shrink to fit their silence because their silence hurts more than anything they could say. And that's exactly why it works. Because you're no longer engaging out of connection. You're engaging to avoid exile. That's the power of weaponized silence. It doesn't raise its voice to dominate. It just disappears long enough to make you desperate for its return. And in that desperation, you begin surrendering pieces of yourself just to hear them speak again. But what if silence wasn't enough? What if they needed to do more than erase your voice? What if they wanted to erase your sense of identity? One piece at a time. Next, we explore identity fragmentation, how breaking you down becomes the first step toward building someone they can control. Identity fragmentation. When you're slowly broken into someone you're not. What if the person in the mirror began to feel unfamiliar, not because you changed on your own, but because someone else was rewriting who you were, piece by piece? What if your identity wasn't taken from you all at once, but dismantled quietly until you no longer trusted your instincts, your values, or your voice? This is the deeply invasive tactic of identity fragmentation, a form of manipulation where your sense of self is slowly broken down, reshaped, and replaced to better fit someone else's control. You don't realize it's happening at first, because it doesn't begin with destruction. It begins with suggestion. They start by questioning small things. Why do you always react like that? That's not really your style, is it? You're not still into that stuff, are you? It sounds casual, but those comments start to chip away at you. Your hobbies, your beliefs, your boundaries. Everything becomes open for critique until you start second-guessing who you are. Then comes the reshaping. They praise you when you're compliant. They reward you when you mirror them. They define you in ways that feel flattering at first. You're not like other people. You get it. You're so much calmer now. I've helped you grow. And you begin to adapt. You change the way you speak. You adjust your opinions. You dress differently, think differently, act differently, not from freedom, but from survival. The more fragmented you become, the easier it is for them to fill in the blanks, to plant new definitions, to build someone more agreeable, less defiant, more useful. And if you ever resist, they'll remind you of how far you've come, how much better you are now, how you used to be a mess. So you stay fragmented because questioning the new identity means facing the terrifying thought that you've been rewritten. That's the slow devastation of identity fragmentation. It doesn't erase you overnight. It breaks you into pieces and hands you back only the ones that serve them, until one day you wake up wondering what happened to you. But what if that new version of you came with rewards? What if they convinced you that you were strong, capable, and empowered as long as you stayed within the lines they drew? Next, we explore false empowerment, how praise becomes a leash disguised as wings. False empowerment. When praise becomes a leash disguised as wings. What if someone made you feel powerful, but only in the ways that kept you under their control? What if they built you up with compliments, encouragement, and trust, but only so long as you never stepped outside the boundaries they quietly set? This is the illusion of false empowerment, a manipulation tactic where you're told you're free, capable, or trusted, but only within the limits that benefit the manipulator. It doesn't feel like control. It feels like support at first. They'll say things like, "I know you can handle this. You're so strong. You're not like other people. I can count on you. You've grown so much since you've been with me." And you believe them. You feel seen, valued. They trust you to take charge, to lead, to rise, but only in the direction they approve. Step beyond that. Ask too many questions. Change in ways they didn't authorize. Suddenly their tone shifts. You're too much. You're getting cocky. You're drifting away from what really matters. The same traits they praised, your independence, your confidence, your voice, are now framed as threats. And just like that, the empowerment vanishes because it was never real. It was permission, dressed as praise. False empowerment isn't about building you up. It's about making you believe they're the reason you've grown, so that if you ever try to leave, you'll question whether you can still be that strong without them. You end up doubting your strength, even while appearing empowered, because the freedom you were given was conditional. It came with unspoken terms and one clear warning: you can be anything as long as it doesn't threaten their grip. That's the trap of false empowerment. It flatters you into a cage, and by the time you realize the wings they gave you were clipped, you're already afraid to fly alone. But what if the manipulation didn't hide behind flattery or praise? What if it wore the mask of compassion, fake empathy, timed tears, and choreographed concern, just enough to keep you close? Next, we explore performative empathy, how faking care becomes the ultimate emotional camouflage. Performative empathy, when care is just another costume. What if someone could say all the right words, show all the right emotions, and look exactly like they care without feeling any of it at all? What if empathy wasn't a connection, but a performance? This is the quiet deception of performative empathy, a manipulation tactic where the appearance of care is used to disarm, control, and silence, without ever offering true understanding. It looks warm. It sounds sincere. but it's scripted. They know when to nod, when to whisper, "I'm here for you," when to shed the single tear at just the right moment. They listen with soft eyes, but only when it suits them, only when it benefits their image, only when caring is the most efficient way to keep you in place. After hurting you, they say, "I just feel so awful about what I did," then shift the focus to their pain. In public, they speak eloquently about kindness and compassion, while privately ignoring or invalidating your struggles. When you're at your breaking point, they offer comfort not to support you, but to reset the emotional balance just enough to keep you from walking away. It's empathy as a tool, a spotlight, a calculated act to maintain the illusion that they're the good one, the understanding one, the victim, even. And when you try to call it out, when something feels off, they turn it back on you. "Are you saying I don't care? You don't believe me? After everything I've done to support you?" Now you're the one who looks heartless. Now you're questioning your judgment again. Because they were so kind, weren't they? But empathy without accountability is manipulation. And kindness used to control you isn't kindness at all. That's the mask of performative empathy. It gives just enough softness to keep you quiet, just enough warmth to make you doubt your coldness, and just enough presence to excuse their absence. And when care becomes theater, you're always playing the part of someone who owes them another chance. But what if they didn't act like they were kind? What if they acted like they were better, morally superior, spiritually evolved above reproach, and used that righteousness to keep you beneath them? Next, we explore moral high ground abuse, how superiority becomes a weapon disguised as virtue. Moral high ground abuse, when righteousness becomes a weapon. What if every disagreement wasn't just a difference in opinion, but proof that you were less evolved, less kind, less worthy? What if the person you challenged didn't just think they were right, they believed they were better? This is the isolating tactic of moral high ground abuse. A manipulation where someone uses their claimed ethics, values, or higher principles to silence dissent, dismiss your feelings, or even frame you as wrong simply for questioning them. They don't dominate with volume. They dominate with virtue. "I'm just trying to do the right thing. If you can't see that, maybe you're not where I am yet. I would never behave like that. I guess we just have different values." Some of us care more about integrity than being liked. It sounds noble, measured, above the drama, but it leaves you in a quiet corner feeling petty, reactive, or small. Because how do you argue with someone who's positioned themselves as morally superior? You can't. Every time you speak up, they suggest your tone is off, that your motive is suspect, that your emotional response proves they're the calm, reasonable one and you're the unstable problem. This tactic is especially brutal in spiritual communities, activist circles, or any relationship built on shared values. They co-opt language meant for growth and healing and turn it into a shield. "You're being negative. That's not very enlightened. I'm just trying to hold space." You're being confrontational. But what's really happening is dismissal. Not of your ideas, but of your character. They frame your disagreement as a flaw and their dominance as virtue. And suddenly, the conversation isn't about what's true, it's about who's better. That's the grip of moral high ground abuse. It makes you question your goodness just for having a voice, and if you're not careful, you'll start thinking silence is integrity, when really it's submission. But what if they didn't even wait for conflict to begin? What if they played the victim first, flipping the script before you ever had a chance to speak? Next, we explore preemptive victimhood, how manipulators cry foul before you can cry out. Preemptive victimhood, when they cry first to keep you silent. What if every time you were hurt, the person who caused it made themselves the victim before you could say a word? What if they beat you to the pain, not because they were suffering, but because it gave them the upper hand? This is the manipulative twist of preemptive victimhood, a tactic where someone adopts the role of the wounded party first, framing your reaction as an attack before you even get the chance to express what actually happened. It's not just deflection, it's defense by inversion. You're about to bring up something that hurts you, but before you can, they sigh, "I can't believe you're mad at me. Do you know how hard this week has been for me? I already feel terrible about everything. Why would you pile more on? You always make me the bad guy. I can never do anything right with you." And suddenly, you're not the one seeking accountability. You're the aggressor. You're the insensitive one. You're the reason they're in pain again. It's brilliant, in a cruel way, because it reframes the entire dynamic. They get to cry first, they get to collapse first, and the spotlight of care moves to them, even when you were the one bleeding. You end up comforting the person who hurt you. You hold back your truth to protect their feelings. You walk away from the conversation with more guilt than healing. Over time, you stop speaking up altogether, because you already know how it ends, with them trembling, and you apologizing. Again, this tactic is especially toxic when they've hurt you in subtle ways, ways that are hard to name, easy to downplay, or tied to past patterns, because the more invisible the damage, the easier it is for them to paint you as the one throwing the first punch. That's the trap of preemptive victimhood. It steals your voice by making you feel cruel for using it, and once someone makes you believe that your pain is an attack, you stop defending yourself and start defending them instead. But what if they didn't rely on lies or logic at all? What if they simply kept you guessing, kind one day, cold the next, until you couldn't tell which version was real? Next, we explore strategic inconsistency, how unpredictability becomes addiction and confusion becomes control. Strategic inconsistency. When unpredictability becomes a cage. What if the person you trusted most shifted like weather? Sunlight one day, a storm the next. What if the very thing that kept you hooked was never knowing which version of them you were going to get? This is the disorienting power of strategic inconsistency, a manipulation tactic where the unpredictability itself becomes the control mechanism. Not through rules, but through emotional roulette. Not through routine, but through chaos wrapped in charm. One moment, they're affectionate, present, playful. The next, they're distant, cold, dismissive, then back again, without warning. And you, caught in the whiplash, start chasing the good moments, even if they're crumbs. You think, maybe I said something wrong. Maybe if I'm extra patient, they'll come back. Maybe it's my job to keep the peace. But none of it is about you. It's about control through instability. Because predictable people allow you to breathe, but strategically inconsistent people make you hold your breath, waiting to see who they'll be today. They lash out, then shower you with tenderness. They ignore you, then act like nothing happened. They hurt you, then become so sweet it makes you question your own memory. And that contrast, the sharpness of the bad followed by the rush of the good, it's addictive, like a gambler waiting for a win, like a child trying to earn a smile, like a prisoner hoping the guard is in a good mood today. You stop seeking balance. You stop demanding clarity. You just hope for a good version of them and blame yourself when you don't get it. And that's the trap. They don't have to lock the door. They just make you too dizzy to find the exit. That's the lasting grip of strategic inconsistency. It turns inconsistency into intimacy, and by the time you realize you've been trained to crave the chaos, you've forgotten what it feels like to feel safe. And remember, the sharpest minds are the ones that refuse to be shaped without consent. If you found yourself recognizing these tactics, not just in others, but maybe in moments of your own life, that's not weakness. That's awareness. And awareness is the beginning of freedom. If this resonated with you, feel free to share what stood out most in the comments, not just for me, but for the next person reading who needs to know they're not alone. And if you'd like to keep exploring the darker corners of human psychology, subscribing helps you stay close. Liking lets this message reach someone else who might need it. And every voice added below keeps the conversation alive. Until next time, stay aware, stay sharp,